Did you know that most marriages don't end because of one terrible moment? They end because of thousands of small moments that made one person feel invisible? After 20 years of marriage, Naomi Mercer finally stopped waiting. Not waiting for flowers, not waiting for expensive vacations, not waiting for grand apologies. She stopped waiting for her husband to notice she was lonely while lying beside him every night. And the heartbreaking part? Daniel Mercer truly believed he was a good husband. He paid the bills, built a beautiful home, stayed faithful, worked hard for his family. But somewhere between promotions, responsibilities, routines, and exhaustion, he stopped seeing the woman who once made that house feel alive. Tonight's story is not about villains. It's about something far more dangerous. Emotional neglect that happens quietly. It's about the kind of marriage where nobody screams, but one person slowly disappears. And if you've ever loved someone who stopped listening, if you've ever stayed patient hoping someone would finally notice your pain, or if you've ever been so busy providing that you forgot how to truly be present, then this story will stay with you. Because sometimes the saddest words in a marriage are not, "I hate you." They are, "I'm tired of waiting." But before we begin, welcome back to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, the home of emotional American storytelling that touches the heart and teaches real-life lessons about love, marriage, sacrifice, healing, and second chances. If stories like this speak to you, take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and comment below. What slowly destroys love? Trust me. By the end of this story, your answer may change forever. Now, let's begin. The first sign that something had changed was so small, Daniel almost ignored it. Naomi stopped waiting up for him. For years, no matter how late he came home, some part of her remained awake. Sometimes she sat on the couch pretending to read. Sometimes she folded laundry while an old jazz playlist hummed softly through the house. Sometimes she simply waited in silence with a cup of tea growing cold beside her. Daniel used to find comfort in that. There was something reassuring about opening the front door after another 12-hour workday, and knowing someone was still awake who cared whether he made it home safely. But over time, he stopped noticing it. Or maybe worse, he started expecting it. That Thursday night in October, rain covered the streets of West Hartford in silver reflections as Daniel pulled into the driveway shortly after 11:30 p.m. The kitchen lights were off. The living room was dark. Only the small lamp near the staircase remained on. He loosened his tie slowly as he stepped inside the quiet house. "Naomi." He called out automatically. No answer. He frowned slightly. Normally she would at least say goodnight from upstairs. Daniel checked the kitchen clock out of habit before setting his keys down. He wasn't even sure why the silence unsettled him. Naomi had every right to sleep. Still, something felt unfamiliar. He walked upstairs quietly and opened their bedroom door. Naomi was asleep on her side, facing the window, wrapped in a grey blanket with a book resting beside her pillow. The soft glow from the streetlights outside brushed gently across her face. For a moment, Daniel simply stood there, watching her. 20 years. 20 years with the same woman. That thought should have felt ordinary by now, but lately it frightened him in ways he couldn't explain. Because somewhere deep inside himself, Daniel had begun sensing distance he could no longer control. He changed clothes quietly and slipped into bed beside her. Naomi didn't move closer anymore. That was another small thing. Years ago, even half asleep, she instinctively reached for him. Now there was space between them. Not large, but noticeable. Daniel stared at the ceiling. His mind drifted automatically toward work deadlines, client meetings, financial reports, next quarter projections. Then, unexpectedly, another thought interrupted. When was the last time Naomi laughed with him? Not politely, not softly smiling. Really laughed. He couldn't remember. The realization bothered him enough that sleep came slowly. The next morning smelled like cinnamon and coffee. Daniel walked downstairs expecting another rushed Friday morning. Instead, he stopped halfway down the staircase. Naomi stood near the kitchen island arranging fresh flowers into a glass vase. Soft acoustic music played quietly in the background. For the first time in months, she looked peaceful. Not excited, not overly happy, just calm. She wore cream-colored lounge pants and one of his old university sweatshirts. Her curls were tied loosely above her head, and sunlight poured through the windows behind her. Daniel watched silently for a second longer than necessary. There had been a time he would have walked straight over, wrapped his arms around her waist, kissed her neck, and made her laugh before breakfast. Now he wasn't sure whether that version of them still existed. "You're up early," he said. Naomi glanced back. "Couldn't sleep. You okay?" She continued, trimming flower stems. Daniel poured coffee into his travel mug. "What are those for?" "I bought them yesterday. I can see that." A faint smile touched her lips. "They're for the dining room." Daniel nodded awkwardly. It struck him suddenly that they had begun speaking like polite neighbors. Functional, careful, predictable. The intimacy was disappearing from the spaces between sentences. You have plans today? He asked. Naomi placed another flower into the vase. I'm going into the city later. For a writing workshop. Daniel blinked. A writing workshop? Yes. Since when? Naomi finally looked directly at him. I signed up 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. Daniel felt strangely embarrassed that he hadn't known. Oh, he cleared his throat. That's good. It is. Another silence settled between them. The old version of Naomi would have filled it immediately, telling him details, asking questions, pulling him into conversation naturally. Now, she simply let silence exist. And somehow, that silence forced Daniel to finally hear himself. How long is the workshop? He asked. 10 weeks. You're serious about it? Yes. There was no hesitation in her answer. Daniel studied her carefully. Something about her felt different lately. Not dramatic, steadier, like someone slowly returning to herself after years of being emotionally asleep. Oddly enough, instead of making him happy, it made him nervous. He checked the time quickly. I should go. Drive safely. Daniel grabbed his briefcase, but paused near the doorway. Naomi, yeah? I know I've been busy lately. She nodded once. You've been busy for a long time. The words weren't sharp. That made them worse. Before he could respond, she returned to arranging flowers. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, Daniel suddenly felt like he was watching someone emotionally prepare to leave a place she had already outgrown. Naomi waited until she heard his car disappear, before exhaling slowly. The kitchen became quiet again except for the music. For years, mornings like this hurt. The distance, the emotional emptiness, the feeling of being unseen inside her own marriage. But lately, something unexpected had begun happening. The pain was fading. Not because things improved, because she was finally accepting reality. And acceptance, she was learning, could feel strangely peaceful. She carried the flowers into the dining room and adjusted them near the window. 20 years. 20 years of loving someone who always meant well but rarely slowed down long enough to truly see her. Daniel loved through responsibility, through providing, through solving problems. But Naomi had spent years starving for emotional presence. At first, she blamed stress, then work, then parenthood, then timing. Eventually, she realized something painful. Some people never learn how to love emotionally unless life forces them to confront themselves. And Daniel avoided emotional confrontation the way some people avoid fire. Her phone buzzed softly. Claire. Naomi smiled slightly before answering. How are you feeling today? Claire asked warmly. Lighter. That's new. It is. Naomi sat near the window. Outside, orange leaves drifted slowly across the lawn. For years, autumn had made her sad. It reminded her too much of time passing. Now it felt honest somehow. Things changed. People changed. Love changed. Pretending otherwise only prolonged suffering. Did you tell him about the workshop? Claire asked. Yes. And? Naomi gave a small laugh. He didn't know I signed up. A pause. How did that make you feel? Months ago, Naomi would have said, hurt, forgotten, unimportant. But today the answer surprised even her. It made me realize how long I've been waiting for permission to exist separately from him. Claire stayed quiet, allowing the thought room to breathe. Naomi continued softly. I spent so many years organizing my life around his needs that I forgot I was still a person outside this marriage. And now? Naomi looked toward the dining room flowers. Now I want to remember her. Daniel's office overlooked downtown Hartford from the 22nd floor. Years ago, walking into that office filled him with pride. Today, it mostly filled him with exhaustion. Morning, Dan, his assistant called. Morning. He moved through meetings automatically, barely listening as executives discussed quarterly projections. Normally, work consumed him completely. Today, his mind kept drifting back home. A writing workshop. 3 weeks, and he never noticed. At noon, his longtime colleague Marcus dropped into the office holding takeout containers. You look terrible, Marcus said casually. Daniel snorted. Good afternoon to you too. I'm serious. You sleeping? Not really. Marcus sat across from him. Everything okay at home? Daniel hesitated. That alone answered the question. Marcus leaned back slowly. Naomi? Daniel rubbed his jaw. She's been distant. Marcus laughed softly. My friend, women are distant long before men notice. Daniel frowned slightly. What's that supposed to mean? It means, by the time a wife stops complaining, you should be worried. Those words landed harder than Daniel expected, because Naomi had stopped complaining. Years ago she used to ask for things. Date nights, weekends away, more conversations, less late work. Eventually, she stopped asking. At the time, Daniel thought that meant they had matured. Now he wondered whether she had simply grown tired. She's taking some writing class, Daniel muttered. Marcus nodded. That sounds healthy. I didn't know about it. Marcus looked at him carefully. How much don't you know lately? Daniel didn't answer, and that silence said everything. That evening, Naomi attended her first writing workshop in a renovated brick building downtown. The classroom smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. People chatted softly while setting notebooks onto tables. Naomi almost turned around before entering, not because she was afraid of writing, because she had spent so many years shrinking herself that doing something purely for herself still felt unnatural. First time? A voice asked kindly. Naomi turned. A man around her age smiled warmly while adjusting reading glasses. Is it that obvious? A little. She laughed softly. It surprised her how unfamiliar laughter had become lately. I'm Elliot, he said. Naomi, you write professionally? No, just privately. The best writers usually start that way. There was nothing flirtatious in his tone, just genuine kindness. And strangely, that alone almost made Naomi emotional, because kindness without expectation had become rare in her life. The instructor entered moments later, and everyone settled into their seats. Good writing, she began, requires honesty. Not performance, not perfection. Honesty. Naomi felt those words somewhere deep inside herself. For years, she had been performing strength, performing patience, performing understanding. But honesty would have sounded like, I'm lonely, I miss myself. I don't know how much longer I can live emotionally unseen. The instructor continued. This workshop isn't about becoming impressive writers, it's about becoming truthful observers of your own life. Naomi lowered her eyes slowly toward the blank notebook in front of her. Then, for the first time in years, she began writing for herself instead of surviving for everyone else. The first thing Naomi wrote was not about Daniel. That surprised her. For years, nearly every private thought she carried somehow circled back to her marriage. What she needed from it, what was missing from it, how much of herself had quietly disappeared inside it. But as the workshop continued, her pen moved somewhere else entirely, toward memory, toward a version of herself she had not visited in years. When the instructor asked everyone to write about the last moment they truly felt seen, Naomi froze. The classroom became quiet, except for pens scratching across paper. Seen, not admired, not needed, not depended on, seen. Naomi stared at the blank page for nearly a full minute before a memory slowly surfaced. Chicago, winter, 1998. She was 28 years old, sitting on the fire escape outside their tiny apartment wrapped in a blanket, while snow drifted softly through the alley below. Daniel had stepped outside, holding 2 mugs of coffee. You're freezing, he'd said. I know. Then, why are you out here? Naomi remembered, smiling at him. Because I needed air. Back then, Daniel used to notice things immediately. The sadness in her voice, the exhaustion in her face, the fear behind her smile. He sat beside her quietly and asked, what happened today? And Naomi remembered thinking, this man listens to my silences. Tears suddenly burned behind her eyes in the classroom. Not because she missed the past, because she missed being emotionally known. Everything okay? Elliot whispered gently beside her. Naomi blinked quickly. Yes. But her voice cracked slightly. Elliot didn't push. He simply slid a small pack of tissues across the table without making the moment awkward. Such a tiny gesture. Yet it affected her more than she expected. Not because she was attracted to him, but because attentiveness had become so unfamiliar that even basic emotional awareness now startled her. The instructor spoke again. Sometimes people don't change suddenly, she said. Sometimes they slowly become strangers because life taught them to stop paying attention. Naomi's chest tightened quietly, because that sentence felt dangerously close to her marriage. Daniel arrived home earlier than usual again. He told himself it was coincidence, but deep down, he knew better. The house felt different lately, and he couldn't stop noticing it. For years, Naomi's emotional presence filled every room naturally. She hummed while cooking, talked while folding laundry, told random stories during dinner, left handwritten reminders on the refrigerator. Now the house felt organized, peaceful, but emotionally distant, and Daniel was beginning to understand something terrifying. Naomi had stopped emotionally reaching for him. He entered the kitchen and paused. There was a plate covered neatly beside the stove with a note, dinner's in the oven, workshop runs until 9. Daniel stared at the note longer than necessary. Once upon a time, Naomi used to text him paragraphs, funny observations, random thoughts, pictures of sunsets, questions about his day. Now communication had become informational, efficient. He hated how much that bothered him, considering he was the one who slowly created this version of them. Daniel heated the food quietly and sat alone at the dining table. The silence pressed harder tonight. Across from him sat the empty chair Naomi had occupied for 20 years. Suddenly, another memory surfaced unexpectedly. 10 years ago, Naomi sitting in that exact chair trying to tell him about a writing contest she wanted to enter. Daniel remembered answering emails through most of the conversation. At one point, she stopped talking entirely. He hadn't even noticed right away. God. Daniel rubbed his face slowly. How many moments had he half-lived beside her? How many times had she tried reaching him before eventually giving up? His phone buzzed. A message from their daughter, Ava. Dad, did you remember Mom's workshop started tonight? Daniel stared at the text. Even Ava knew. He typed back. Yeah, she told me. But guilt settled heavily in his chest anyway, because Naomi shouldn't have needed to tell him. A husband should notice when his wife starts rebuilding parts of herself she abandoned years earlier. When Naomi returned home that night, she found Daniel sitting in the living room with the television muted. That alone felt unusual. Normally he worked late in his office after dinner. You're home early again, she said softly while removing her coat. Daniel looked up immediately. How was the workshop? Naomi paused slightly. He remembered. It was good. What did you do? She studied him carefully before answering. We wrote about memory. Daniel nodded slowly. Did you like it? Yes. A small silence followed. Then unexpectedly, Daniel asked, when did you stop writing? The question caught her off guard. Years ago, she talked constantly about writing. Short stories, essays, little unfinished novels hidden in desk drawers. Eventually, real life became louder. Marriage, bills, parenthood, schedules. Naomi set her bag down slowly. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe around the time I started putting everyone else first. The words weren't intended as an attack, but Daniel still flinched internally, because the truth inside them was impossible to avoid. He leaned forward slightly. You make it sound like I stopped you. You didn't stop me, Naomi said gently. I stopped myself. Then why does it feel like you blame me? Naomi looked tired suddenly. Because you only hear blame when I talk about pain. Daniel opened his mouth, then stopped. That sentence hit too close to something he'd been avoiding for years. Whenever Naomi expressed hurt, his instinct was always to defend himself instead of understanding her. Not because he didn't care, because somewhere deep inside, failure terrified him. If Naomi was unhappy, then maybe he had failed as a husband. And rather than sit with that discomfort, he explained, justified, solved, or withdrew. He never learned how to simply stay emotionally present. Naomi sat across from him quietly. You know what the hardest part is? She asked softly. Daniel looked at her. I honestly don't think you ever realized I was disappearing. The room fell silent. Daniel felt something painful shift inside his chest. Because she was right. He noticed exhaustion, stress, mood changes. But he never truly understood the depth of her loneliness. How bad was it? He asked quietly. Naomi gave a faint, sad smile. That question alone tells me everything. Daniel frowned slightly. What does that mean? If you have to ask how lonely your wife became after 20 years. She paused carefully. Then you probably weren't standing emotionally close enough to see it happening. Those words stayed suspended heavily between them. Daniel suddenly felt exposed in ways work never exposed him. At work, he always knew the solution, the strategy, the next move. Here? He didn't know how to repair damage he barely understood. Naomi stood slowly. I'm tired. Good night, Daniel. He watched her walk upstairs, and for the first time in years, he didn't turn the television back on afterward. He simply sat there, alone with the terrifying realization that his marriage might not be collapsing loudly. It might already be quietly ending. 3 days later, Ava came home for the weekend. The moment she walked through the front door, the energy inside the house shifted slightly. Ava Mercer had Naomi's eyes, and Daniel's stubbornness. At 24, she carried herself with calm confidence, though Naomi often joked that Ava secretly observed everyone like a therapist collecting notes. Mom. Ava smiled, hugging Naomi tightly in the kitchen. Daniel watched them carefully. Naomi looked genuinely lighter around their daughter, more expressive, more alive. Another realization he hated. How's New York? Naomi asked. Busy, loud, expensive, emotionally unstable. Ava laughed. Daniel hugged his daughter next. You still working yourself to death? Genetics, Ava replied dryly. Naomi hid a smile while Daniel rolled his eyes. Later that evening, the three of them sat together for dinner. At first, conversation flowed easily. Ava's work, city life, funny apartment disasters. Then Ava casually mentioned, Mom sent me one of her workshop pieces yesterday. Daniel looked up immediately. You did? Naomi nodded slightly. She's incredible, Ava said honestly. Like, really incredible. Something complicated crossed Daniel's face. Pride, surprise, regret. How come I haven't read anything? He asked. Naomi looked down briefly at her plate before answering carefully. Because you never really seemed interested before. The honesty in her voice wasn't cruel. That somehow made it worse. Ava glanced between them quietly. Years of observing her parents had taught her how to recognize emotional tension quickly. Daniel tried again. I would be interested. Naomi gave a small, polite nod. Okay, but the response felt distant, like someone agreeing out of courtesy rather than trust. And Daniel realized something painful. In that moment, Naomi no longer expected emotional safety from him. Later that night, Ava found her mother sitting alone on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket. Cold autumn air drifted through the darkness. You okay? Ava asked gently. Naomi smiled softly. Yeah. Ava sat beside her. After a long silence, she asked quietly, Are you leaving, Dad? Naomi looked startled. No. But you've thought about it. Not a question. Naomi stared out into the yard. For a long time I thought staying no matter what made me strong, she admitted softly. And now? Naomi pulled the blanket tighter around herself. Now I think constantly abandoning yourself can look like loyalty when it's actually grief. Ava's eyes filled slightly. She reached for her mother's hand. I used to get so angry at him growing up, Ava whispered, because even when he was home, part of him always felt somewhere else. Naomi looked down slowly. He loves us. I know, Ava said, but love isn't always the same as presence. The words hung quietly in the cold air. And, inside the house, unseen through the kitchen window, Daniel stood frozen after accidentally overhearing everything. Before we continue this emotional journey, take a second to ask yourself something honestly. Have you ever stayed quiet in a relationship because you were tired of repeating the same pain over and over again? Sometimes people don't stop loving each other. They just stop believing they are truly being heard. And that's what makes stories like this so heartbreaking. If this chapter touched you in any way, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And in the comments below, tell me, do marriages fail because people stop loving each other, or because they stop paying attention? Your answer may say more than you think. Now let's continue. Daniel barely slept that night. Ava's words kept replaying in his mind over and over again. Even when he was home, part of him always felt somewhere else. The sentence followed him through the darkness, like an accusation he couldn't escape. Around 3 in the morning, he finally got out of bed and walked downstairs. The house was silent except for the refrigerator humming softly in the kitchen. For years, Daniel believed silence meant stability. No fighting, no chaos, no dramatic conflict. Now he was beginning to understand that silence could also mean resignation. He poured himself water and stood by the sink, staring into the dark backyard. How had he missed this? Not one argument, not one terrible betrayal. Just years of emotional absence slowly collecting interest like unpaid debt. And the worst part? He truly loved Naomi. Even now, after 20 years, he couldn't imagine his life without her. But somewhere along the way, he had confused loving someone with simply remaining beside them. The terrifying realization settling into his chest was this. Naomi no longer seemed emotionally certain he could meet her where she lived inside herself. And maybe she had stopped believing that years ago. The next morning, Naomi woke early again. Sunlight filtered softly through the bedroom curtains while Daniel slept beside her. She studied him quietly for a moment. Age had softened him. The sharp ambition that once drove him constantly now looked more like exhaustion carved into human form. There was a time she could read every emotion on his face before he spoke. Now he often looked closed off, even in sleep. Naomi slipped carefully out of bed and headed downstairs. She had just started making tea when she heard footsteps behind her. Daniel, you're awake early, she said. So are you. His voice sounded rough from lack of sleep. Naomi noticed immediately. 20 years together trained her to notice small things automatically. Ironically, she still knew him far better than he knew her. You okay? She asked. Daniel hesitated. I heard you and Ava talking last night. Naomi stopped stirring her tea. For a second, neither spoke. Then she nodded slowly. Okay, that's it? What else should I say? Daniel rubbed his jaw. I didn't mean to overhear. I know. Another silence. Naomi could feel tension building beneath his calm expression. Daniel wasn't naturally emotional, but when something deeply unsettled him, his entire body became restless. Finally, he asked quietly, Have you really been that unhappy? Naomi closed her eyes briefly. There it was again, that question. Not, what did I miss? Not, how did we get here? Have you really been that unhappy? As if her loneliness still surprised him. She looked at him carefully. You keep asking that like pain only becomes real if it reaches some dramatic level. Daniel frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means loneliness doesn't always look tragic. Daniel. Her voice remained soft. Sometimes it looks like making dinner for someone who stopped noticing your favorite stories years ago. He looked down. Naomi continued quietly. Sometimes it looks like celebrating birthdays with someone physically present, but emotionally exhausted. Every word landed with painful precision, because none of them were exaggerated. That's not fair. Daniel muttered weakly. Naomi's expression shifted sadly. You see? That's what I mean. What? You hear honesty as criticism. Daniel exhaled sharply. I'm trying here, Naomi. I know, but even that sounded tired now. Not hopeful, just acknowledging effort. Too late. Daniel leaned against the counter heavily. I don't know what you want me to say. Naomi looked at him for a long moment, before answering. That's part of the problem. You always think moments like this are about finding the correct response, instead of being emotionally present. Daniel fell quiet. Because, deep down, he understood exactly what she meant. At work, he solved problems, fixed systems, managed crises. But emotions, vulnerability, uncertainty, those things always made him feel powerless. And powerless was the one thing Daniel Mercer never knew how to tolerate. Later that afternoon, Ava joined Naomi downtown for coffee. The cafe sat near the riverfront, warm with conversation and soft jazz drifting through hidden speakers. Naomi smiled as Ava dramatically collapsed into the chair across from her. I forgot how peaceful Connecticut is, Ava groaned. New York is like living inside someone else's anxiety attack. Naomi laughed softly. There it was again, that unfamiliar ease slowly returning to her life. Ava noticed it too. You've changed, she said gently. Naomi looked up from her coffee. Have the first? In a good way. A small, thoughtful silence settled between them. Then, Ava asked carefully, Are you scared? Naomi understood immediately. Of change, of letting go, of no longer pretending everything was fine. Yes, she admitted. Because of Dad? Naomi stared out the cafe window. Partly. And the other part? Naomi gave a faint, sad smile. I spent so many years being someone's wife, someone's mother, someone people depended on. She paused. I'm not fully sure who I became underneath all that. Ava reached across the table and squeezed her hand gently. You know what I think? What? I think you disappeared so gradually that everyone, including you, got used to living without parts of you. The honesty nearly made Naomi emotional, because it was true. And maybe the saddest part was how common it seemed among women her age. Entire generations taught to endure quietly, to nurture endlessly, to shrink gracefully, until one day they woke up emotionally exhausted inside lives they helped build. Ava tilted her head slightly. Do you still love him? Naomi answered immediately. Yes. No hesitation. That wasn't the problem. Love had survived. What died slowly was trust that the love would ever become emotionally fulfilling again. I think he's scared, Ava said quietly. Naomi looked down into her coffee. So am I. That evening, Daniel sat alone in his office pretending to work. The spreadsheet open on his computer had not changed in nearly 20 minutes. His thoughts kept drifting. To Naomi, to Ava, to old memories he suddenly couldn't stop revisiting. He remembered their first apartment again. Back then, Naomi filled every empty space with life. Music while cooking. Books scattered everywhere. Long conversations at midnight. Dreams spoken out loud without embarrassment. Daniel used to admire how emotionally alive she was. So how had he become the man who slowly dimmed that light? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Marcus stepped inside holding 2 coffees. You look worse today, Marcus observed. Daniel snorted tiredly. Appreciate the support. Marcus sat across from him. Talk to me. Daniel hesitated before finally speaking. I think Naomi's given up on me. Marcus stayed quiet. No quick reassurance. That alone told Daniel this conversation was serious. She says, I haven't been emotionally present for years. Marcus nodded once. Were you? Daniel looked frustrated immediately. I worked hard for my family. That's not what I asked. Daniel leaned back heavily. I did everything right. Marcus gave him a long look. No, he said calmly. You did everything practical. The distinction hit Daniel hard. Marcus continued. Men like us grow up believing love means sacrifice and provision. We think responsibility automatically translates emotionally. He shrugged slightly. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Daniel stared down at his desk. She says I stopped seeing her. Marcus nodded slowly. Did you? Daniel's silence answered. Marcus sighed softly. You know what kills long marriages most often? What? Assumption. Daniel looked up. We assume there will always be more time, more conversations, more chances to reconnect later. Marcus shook his head. Then one day, the person beside you emotionally checks out while you're still making future plans. Those words unsettled Daniel deeply, because Naomi already felt emotionally farther away than she had ever been. Not angry, almost worse, peaceful, as if she had stopped fighting internally. And people stopped fighting when they stopped believing change was possible. That night, Naomi sat at the dining table writing while rain tapped softly against the windows. The workshop assignment was simple. Write about the moment you realized something important was ending. At first, Naomi thought about marriage immediately. But then another memory surfaced. Her father. She was 17 when she realized her parents no longer loved each other romantically. Not because they screamed, not because they separated, because her mother stopped expecting tenderness. Naomi remembered watching her mother clear dishes one evening, while her father discussed work without once looking up. Her mother smiled politely, nodded politely, answered politely, but, emotionally, she was already gone. At 17, Naomi promised herself she would never live like that. The irony almost made her laugh now. Her pen moved slowly across the page. Sometimes relationships do not die dramatically. Sometimes they die through emotional starvation. One person keeps hoping, the other keeps postponing, until eventually the waiting becomes heavier than the loneliness itself. Naomi stopped writing suddenly. Footsteps approached. Daniel. He stood quietly near the dining room entrance watching her. "What are you writing?" he asked softly. Naomi closed the notebook instinctively. Daniel noticed. The small action hurt more than it should have. "You used to let me read everything," he said. Naomi looked at him carefully. "You used to want to—" The room fell silent again. Daniel walked closer slowly. "I'm trying to understand." Naomi's eyes softened slightly at that. For the first time in days, she believed him. Not because he suddenly understood everything, because he finally sounded uncertain instead of defensive. And uncertainty meant something important. He was beginning to confront himself honestly. Daniel stood beside the dining table longer than necessary. Rain continued against the windows, while Naomi rested one hand over her closed notebook protectively. Years ago, there had been no emotional distance around her writing. She used to hand him unfinished paragraphs while brushing her teeth, read dialogue out loud from the kitchen, wake him up at midnight just to share a sentence she loved. Back then, Daniel always assumed there would be more time to pay attention later. Now, later had arrived, and he was standing outside parts of her inner life he no longer knew how to enter. "I did want to," he said quietly. Naomi looked at him gently. "I know you think that—" The sentence wasn't cruel. That made it harder to hear. Daniel pulled out the chair across from her and sat down slowly. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he asked, "When did you stop talking to me?" Naomi blinked slightly. The question surprised her, because it was the first question he'd asked that didn't immediately center his confusion or defend his intentions. She considered it honestly. "I don't think I stopped all at once," she admitted softly. "I think I stopped in pieces." Daniel felt his chest tighten. "What does that mean?" Naomi stared down briefly at her hands. "It means every time I tried to tell you something important, and you were distracted." She paused carefully. "A small part of me learned not to try again." Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. God, how many times had he answered emails while she spoke? Checked his phone during dinner? Half-listened while mentally solving work problems? Too many. And the horrifying part was that none of it felt malicious at the time. It felt temporary, necessary, normal. He never realized temporary neglect could accumulate into permanent loneliness. Naomi continued quietly. "You always said we'd reconnect once things slowed down." Daniel swallowed hard. Because he had said that, after promotions, after deadlines, after Ava left for college, after the next project, always later. "I believed you for a long time," Naomi whispered. Daniel looked up slowly. "And then?" Naomi's eyes glistened faintly under the dining room light. "And then I realized life doesn't pause while someone learns how to prioritize you." The truth in those words settled heavily into the room. Daniel suddenly saw their marriage differently than he ever had before. Not as one catastrophic failure, but as thousands of moments where Naomi quietly needed emotional closeness. And he unknowingly taught her to survive without it. The next week passed strangely, not dramatically tense, not openly emotional, just different. Daniel began noticing things he had ignored for years. Naomi humming softly while watering plants. How often she sat outside alone now. How rarely she initiated conversation anymore. How careful she had become with her emotions around him. And perhaps, most painful of all, how independent she had learned to be, emotionally. It disturbed him deeply, because once upon a time, Naomi depended on him for comfort, instinctively. Now she seemed to have built an entire emotional life that no longer required him to participate. Tuesday evening, Daniel came home to find music drifting through the house again. He followed the sound toward the kitchen. Naomi stood barefoot near the counter rolling dough, while an old jazz record played softly nearby. For a second, he froze. The image hit him with unexpected force, because it looked like the Naomi he remembered from years ago. Alive, present, softly expressive. But the painful difference was this. That version of her no longer seemed connected to him. "You're baking?" he asked. Naomi glanced up. "Cinnamon bread. You haven't made that in years." "I know." Daniel loosened his tie slowly. The kitchen smelled warm and familiar. Suddenly, another memory surfaced vividly. Snowstorm. Chicago apartment, Naomi dancing badly in socks while cinnamon bread baked in the oven. He remembered grabbing her waist, her laughing uncontrollably. Both of them young enough to believe love alone guaranteed permanence. How was work? Naomi asked politely. Busy. She nodded once and returned to kneading dough. Daniel stood there awkwardly. Years ago, this kitchen felt emotionally alive between them. Now, conversations felt fragile, like two people learning each other's language again after years apart. Finally, he asked, "Why did you stop making this?" Naomi's hands slowed slightly. Then she answered honestly, "Because it used to make me sad." Daniel frowned. "Why?" She gave a faint, tired smile. "It reminded me of who we used to be." The words landed directly in the center of his chest. Because Daniel missed those people too. He just hadn't realized how long Naomi had been grieving them alone. Later that night, Daniel found himself unable to concentrate again. He walked into his home office, stared at his laptop for 10 minutes, then shut it again. Instead, he opened an old storage cabinet near the desk. Inside were photo albums Naomi organized years earlier. Daniel sat slowly in the chair and opened one. Vacation photos, birthday dinners, Christmas mornings, Ava's school recitals. In nearly every picture, Naomi looked directly at him. That realization shook him unexpectedly. Even in photographs, she had spent years emotionally reaching toward him. And him? In many pictures he was distracted, looking elsewhere, mid-conversation with someone else. Half engaged, Daniel rubbed his forehead slowly. He thought being physically loyal was enough. Thought responsibility proved devotion. Thought exhaustion justified emotional absence. Now he was beginning to understand something deeply uncomfortable. You can love someone sincerely and still neglect them profoundly. The realization hollowed him out. A photograph slipped loose from the album onto the floor. Daniel picked it up carefully. Naomi, age 32. Standing on a beach during their anniversary trip to Maine. She was laughing directly at him behind the camera. Written on the back in her handwriting, "You looked at me like I mattered that day." Daniel closed his eyes immediately, because he couldn't remember the last time he intentionally looked at her that way. Meanwhile, Naomi sat inside the workshop classroom listening quietly as people shared pieces of their writing aloud. Some stories were funny, some painful, some unfinished in ways that felt deeply human. Then, Elliot began reading. His story wasn't romantic. It was about regret, about losing his wife to cancer 6 years earlier and realizing afterward how many conversations he rushed through while assuming there would always be more time. "I spent years thinking love meant staying," Elliot read softly. "But love also means noticing. And I noticed too many things after it was already too late." The room became painfully quiet. Naomi felt emotion tighten unexpectedly inside her chest. Because grief sounded strangely similar, whether someone physically left or emotionally drifted away. After class ended, Elliot packed his notebook slowly beside her. "You okay?" he asked gently. Naomi nodded. His story hit hard. Elliot gave a small, sad smile. Most honest stories do. They walked toward the parking lot together. Cold autumn air wrapped around the streetlights outside. "You write like someone waking up," Elliot said casually. Naomi looked surprised. "What does that mean?" "It means your writing feels like someone rediscovering their own voice after years of silence." The comment affected her more deeply than he realized. Not because she needed validation, because for the first time in years, someone described her in a way that felt emotionally accurate. "You ever feel guilty for changing?" she asked quietly. Elliot considered the question. "Sometimes," he admitted, "especially when people benefited from the version of you that kept abandoning yourself." Naomi fell silent. Those words followed her all the way home. When she entered the house later that night, Daniel was waiting in the living room. Not working, not distracted, waiting. Naomi paused slightly. "You're up." Daniel stood slowly. "I wanted to talk." Something in his voice felt different tonight. Less defensive, less certain. Naomi set her bag down carefully. "Okay." Daniel hesitated for several seconds before speaking. Then finally, "I think I've spent most of my life trying to feel successful instead of emotionally available." Naomi looked genuinely surprised. Daniel laughed softly, without humor. "I'm serious." He rubbed his hands together nervously. "I thought if I worked hard enough, provided enough, stayed responsible enough." He exhaled heavily. "Then everything else would naturally stay okay." Naomi listened quietly. "And now?" she asked. Daniel's eyes met hers fully. "Now, I think I used work to avoid parts of myself I didn't know how to deal with." The honesty in his voice unsettled her. Because this was new. Daniel rarely spoke from vulnerability without immediately retreating into logic afterward. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted softly. "And I hate that." Naomi felt something painful move inside her chest. For years, she begged internally for emotional honesty from him. Now that it was finally appearing, she didn't fully know what to do with it. You don't fix 20 years in one conversation, she said gently. Daniel nodded slowly. I know. Silence settled again, but this silence felt different from the others. Not empty, uncertain, tender, fragile. Then Daniel asked the question quietly. Did you ever think about leaving me? Naomi's eyes lowered immediately. That alone gave him the answer before she even spoke. Yes, she whispered. Daniel felt the truth hit him physically, not because he blamed her, because he finally understood how serious her loneliness had become. Naomi looked up slowly. But the saddest part, she said softly, I didn't imagine leaving because I stopped loving you. Daniel's throat tightened. Then why? A tear slipped quietly down her cheek before she answered. Because I stopped believing you could truly see me anymore. Daniel sat awake long after Naomi went upstairs. The house felt unbearably quiet again. But now the silence carried meaning he could no longer ignore. Because for the first time in 20 years, his wife had admitted she once imagined a life without him. Not out of anger, out of emotional exhaustion. That distinction devastated him. Daniel leaned back against the couch and stared into the darkness. He kept replaying her words. I stopped believing you could truly see me anymore. How had he become that man? The younger version of himself would have sworn it could never happen. Back then, loving Naomi felt effortless. No reminders needed, no emotional distance, no careful conversations filled with years of buried hurt. He remembered the exact moment he fell in love with her. University library. Rain, outside. Naomi arguing passionately with someone about a novel neither of them had actually finished. Daniel hadn't been drawn to her beauty first. It was the way she felt fully alive inside herself. She noticed everything, felt everything, spoke like someone unafraid of emotional honesty. And maybe that was why losing connection with her now felt so frightening. Because somewhere over the years, Daniel had become emotionally numb, while Naomi remained emotionally awake. And numbness spreads quietly, especially inside marriages. The next morning, Naomi found him already in the kitchen making coffee. That almost never happened. Daniel usually rushed through mornings mechanically while checking emails before sunrise. Today, his phone sat face down on the counter, untouched. You're up early, Naomi said carefully. Daniel nodded. Couldn't sleep. Neither mentioned the conversation from the night before. Some truths changed the emotional atmosphere of a marriage the moment they were spoken aloud. Daniel handed her a mug automatically, before realizing halfway through the movement. Coffee. Naomi looked at the mug, then at him, and unexpectedly, both of them smiled slightly. You forgot. I switched to tea again, she said softly. Daniel winced immediately. Right. But something about the mistake felt strangely human rather than hurtful this time. For years, those small, forgetful moments piled up like evidence of emotional neglect. Today, Naomi noticed something different. Daniel actually looked affected by it. Not defensive, not dismissive. Present. I'll make tea, he said quickly. It's okay. No, I want to. Naomi watched quietly as he moved around the kitchen, awkwardly searching for the kettle. A strange ache moved through her chest. Because this was the man she spent years hoping for. Not perfect, not magically transformed, simply aware. The realization almost made her angry. Why now? Why, after years of loneliness? Why, after she finally stopped emotionally waiting for him to change? Daniel placed the tea gently beside her. I used to know these things automatically, he admitted quietly. Naomi wrapped her hands around the mug. Yes. Daniel leaned against the counter heavily. I don't know when I became someone who stopped paying attention. Naomi looked down. She did know. It happened gradually. Promotion after promotion. Longer hours. Constant pressure. Emotional exhaustion disguised as responsibility. Daniel didn't stop loving her suddenly. He simply started giving every emotionally available piece of himself to survival, ambition, and obligation until nothing meaningful remained at home. And Naomi adapted around the emptiness until adaptation became identity. You know what the worst part is? Daniel asked softly. Naomi looked up. I genuinely thought we were okay. The honesty in his voice hurt more than excuses would have, because it confirmed what she suspected all along. He truly had no idea how alone she became beside him. Later that afternoon, Naomi attended her writing workshop again. Today's topic was relationships. The instructor stood near the whiteboard holding a stack of papers. Most people think conflict destroys relationships, she said, but avoidance often does more damage than conflict ever could. Naomi immediately thought of Daniel, not because he yelled, not because he was cruel, because he avoided emotional discomfort constantly. If conversations became vulnerable, he redirected them towards solutions. If pain surfaced, he explained it logically. If disappointment appeared, he promised improvement later. Avoidance disguised itself as practicality. And for years, Naomi mistook that practicality for emotional immaturity that would eventually pass. The instructor continued. When people feel emotionally unseen long enough, they stop bringing their inner world into the relationship. That's the beginning of emotional separation. Naomi wrote the sentence down immediately. Beside her, Elliot glanced over. That one hit home too? Naomi gave a quiet laugh. Little bit. The instructor assigned paired discussion exercises. Naomi and Elliot turned their chairs slightly toward each other. Question 1. Elliot read from the paper. What's something you wish people understood about you without needing explanation? Naomi froze unexpectedly. The question reached somewhere deep. Elliot noticed immediately. You can pass if you want. No. Naomi shook her head softly. I'm thinking, what did she wish people understood? Finally she answered quietly, that being needed isn't the same thing as being emotionally loved. Elliot's expression softened. That's a strong sentence. Naomi looked down. It took me a long time to learn it. And now? Naomi hesitated. Now I think a lot of women disappear inside relationships because everyone praises how dependable they are while nobody notices how lonely they've become. Elliot stayed quiet for a moment. Then he said something that lingered painfully with her afterward. The scary thing about emotionally neglected people is that they usually look fine from the outside. Naomi swallowed hard, because she had looked fine for years. That evening, Ava called Daniel unexpectedly. You busy? She asked. Daniel sat in his office, staring blankly at spreadsheets again. Not really. Ava hesitated briefly. How's Mom? Daniel leaned back slowly. I think I'm losing her. The bluntness of his own words startled him. Ava fell silent for a second. Then, you know she loved you harder than anyone. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. I know. No, Ava said gently. I don't think you do. Her tone wasn't cruel. Just honest. Daniel rubbed his forehead tiredly. She says I stopped seeing her. Ava exhaled softly on the other end. Dad. Mom spent years trying to emotionally reach you. Guilt moved sharply through him again. I never meant to hurt her. I know. That was the painful part. Daniel had not failed through malice. He failed through emotional absence. Ava continued carefully. You always showed love through responsibility. But Mom needed emotional intimacy too. Daniel stared out the office window. I thought being stable mattered. It does, Ava replied. But stability without emotional connection eventually starts feeling lonely. Daniel felt emotionally exposed in ways he never allowed himself to feel, because deep down, he understood something uncomfortable. He learned how to succeed professionally far better than he learned how to remain emotionally available in love. And now the consequences were standing directly in front of him. What do I do? He asked quietly. Ava was silent briefly before answering. You stop trying to defend who you intended to be, and start paying attention to who you actually became. The words hit him hard enough to leave him speechless. That night, Naomi arrived home emotionally exhausted. Not from the workshop, from thinking. Thinking about the marriage, about herself, about whether healing something broken for this long was even possible. She entered the kitchen expecting emptiness. Instead, she stopped abruptly. Daniel was cooking, or attempting to. The kitchen looked mildly disastrous. A cutting board sat crooked near the sink. Vegetables were unevenly chopped. Something smelled slightly burned. Naomi stared in genuine disbelief. Daniel looked up awkwardly. I may have underestimated how hard risotto is. For the first time in weeks, Naomi laughed unexpectedly. A real laugh. Warm, uncontrolled, human. Daniel froze slightly at the sound. God, he missed that laugh. More than he realized. Naomi covered her mouth, still smiling. You hate cooking. I know. What are you doing? Daniel looked at the pan helplessly. Trying. The simplicity of the answer softened something inside her despite herself, not because cooking fixed anything, but because effort carried emotional meaning when it came from someone who normally avoided vulnerability. You're burning the garlic, she said gently. Daniel immediately turned toward the stove. Damn! Naomi moved beside him instinctively. Lower the heat. He obeyed automatically. For several quiet minutes, they cooked together. Not perfectly comfortable, not magically repaired, but together. And strangely, the ordinary intimacy of the moment hurt Naomi almost as much as it healed her, because it reminded her how desperately she once wanted moments exactly like this. Daniel glanced sideways at her while stirring carefully. You seem happier lately. Naomi became still. The observation surprised her. Do the first? Yes. She considered denying it. Instead, she answered honestly. I think I finally started reconnecting with myself. Daniel nodded slowly, though sadness flickered briefly across his face, because part of him realized she began reconnecting with herself only after emotionally detaching from him, and that realization frightened him deeply. Dinner turned out terrible. The rice undercooked, the seasoning uneven, the garlic partially burned, but neither mentioned it much, and for the first time in years, they stayed at the table after eating instead of drifting immediately into separate routines. The conversation remained small, careful, occasionally awkward. Yet underneath it lived something fragile and unfamiliar now. Effort, real effort. Then suddenly, Naomi asked quietly, "Can I tell you something honestly?" Daniel looked up immediately. "Always." She held his gaze for several seconds before speaking. "That used to be the saddest part of loving you." Daniel's chest tightened. "What was?" Naomi's voice softened almost to a whisper. "That I never really believed there was room for my honesty inside your world." Daniel didn't answer immediately. Naomi's words settled heavily between them, while the remains of their failed risotto cooled quietly on the table. "That I never really believed there was room for my honesty inside your world." The sentence cut deeper than anger ever could, because Daniel knew exactly what she meant. Whenever Naomi brought him something emotional, complicated, or painful over the years, he instinctively treated it like a problem to solve quickly instead of a feeling to sit beside patiently. He thought reassurance was enough. Thought solutions proved care. Thought fixing things counted as listening. Now he was beginning to understand something devastating. People do not feel emotionally safe simply because you stay. They feel safe when their inner world is welcomed without resistance. Daniel looked down at his hands slowly. "I think I made you feel emotionally alone," he admitted quietly. Naomi swallowed hard. Hearing him say it out loud affected her more than she expected. Not because it erased the pain, because acknowledgement mattered. For years, she felt like she carried invisible grief inside a marriage everyone else admired from the outside. Friends called Daniel dependable, responsible, a good provider, and he was. That was what made her loneliness so difficult to explain. How do you describe emotional starvation besides someone who technically never stopped loving you? Daniel leaned back heavily. "I don't think I understood emotional neglect could happen without cruelty." Naomi's eyes softened slightly. "Most people don't." Silence stretched between them again. But lately, silence no longer felt entirely hopeless. Painful, yes. Fragile, definitely. But honest. And honesty was something their marriage had been missing for years. That weekend, Naomi visited her mother. Elaine Parker lived alone in a quiet neighborhood outside New Haven, surrounded by books, plants, and framed photographs from decades of family life. Naomi stood in the kitchen helping slice apples while her mother prepared tea. "You look lighter," Elaine observed gently. Naomi smiled faintly. Ava said the same thing. "Maybe both of us are noticing the same thing." Naomi leaned against the counter. "I think I spent years emotionally holding my breath." Elaine paused briefly before speaking. "That's exhausting." Naomi looked down. "I didn't even realize how exhausted I was until recently." Her mother studied her carefully. Elaine understood more than Naomi realized. After all, Naomi learned patience by watching her, learned endurance by watching her, learned emotional self-sacrifice by watching her, and, unfortunately, she also learned silence that way. "Your father loved me," Elaine said quietly, while pouring tea. "But he only knew how to show love through responsibility." Naomi looked up immediately. The sentence felt painfully familiar. Elaine sighed softly. "He thought working harder fixed emotional distance." A faint sad smile crossed her face. "By the time he realized I needed more than stability, I had already spent years grieving quietly." Naomi sat slowly at the table. "Why did you stay?" Elaine considered the question carefully. "Because love existed." She paused. "And because women from my generation were taught endurance was noble." Naomi stared into her tea silently. Then Elaine asked gently, "Are you still in love with Daniel?" Naomi answered immediately again, "Yes." The answer came too naturally to deny. Elaine nodded slowly. "And does he know how close he came to losing you emotionally?" Naomi looked away toward the window. "I think he's starting to." Her mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand softly. "Then let him truly see it." Naomi frowned slightly. "What if it's too late?" Elaine's expression turned thoughtful. "Sometimes marriages survive because two people love each other." She paused carefully. "And sometimes they survive because two people become honest enough to rebuild differently." The words stayed with Naomi long after she left. Meanwhile, Daniel spent Saturday morning alone in the garage, pretending to organize old boxes. In reality, he was avoiding himself, avoiding the uncomfortable truth, slowly unfolding in front of him. For years, he believed he was succeeding at marriage because nothing visibly collapsed. No betrayal, no explosive fights, no abandonment. But now he understood something deeper. A relationship can slowly emotionally starve while appearing perfectly functional from the outside. Daniel opened another storage box, absent-mindedly. Inside were old notebooks. Naomi's handwriting covered nearly every one. Curiosity tugged at him before guilt quickly followed. He shouldn't read them. But one notebook had loose pages already falling partially open. A single sentence caught his eye immediately. "I miss being emotionally chosen without having to beg for attention first." Daniel froze. The words punched straight through him. He sat down slowly on the garage floor, staring at the notebook in stunned silence. How long had she been carrying this pain privately? How many signs had he missed because he convinced himself providing materially meant everything important was handled? Another page slipped loose. This one, older. Sometimes I feel guilty for needing more emotional connection than he knows how to give. Daniel closed the notebook immediately. His chest felt unbearably tight. Not because Naomi sounded unreasonable, because she spent years minimizing her own needs to protect him from discomfort. And he never noticed. God, the realization nearly broke something inside him. Sunday evening, Ava came by again before returning to New York. This time, the atmosphere inside the house felt subtly different. Still tender, still uncertain, but more emotionally open. The three of them sat together after dinner, while rain moved softly against the windows outside. At one point, Ava looked between her parents carefully. "You know," she said casually, "this is the longest you two have sat together without Dad checking emails in years." Daniel winced immediately. Naomi looked down quietly. Ava softened her tone. "I'm not trying to attack you, Dad. I know." And he did know. That was the painful part. Everyone noticed his emotional absence, except him. Daniel leaned back slowly. "I honestly thought I was doing everything for this family." "You were," Naomi said gently. He looked at her, but somewhere along the way, she continued softly, "the family stopped getting the emotionally present version of you." The honesty stung because it was true. Daniel stared at the floor for several seconds. Then finally, "I think I was afraid." Naomi blinked slightly. "Of what?" Daniel laughed quietly without humor. "Failing." He rubbed his hands together slowly. "Growing up, my father always said a man's value came from what he provided." He swallowed hard. "So I built my whole identity around being useful." Naomi listened carefully. "And emotions?" she asked softly. Daniel gave a faint, tired smile. Emotions felt messy, unpredictable, like something that distracted people from responsibility. The room fell quiet. Ava looked at him with sudden understanding. For the first time, Daniel wasn't speaking like a defensive husband, trying to justify himself. He sounded like a man finally tracing his own emotional limitations back to their roots. Naomi spoke gently. "You know what's sad?" Daniel looked at her. "You spent so much time trying not to fail us financially." Her voice weakened slightly. "That emotionally, we slowly lost you anyway." The truth nearly knocked the air from his lungs, because she wasn't wrong. Later that night, Naomi sat alone on the back porch wrapped in a blanket. Cold air drifted softly through the darkness. She heard the sliding door open behind her. Daniel stepped outside carrying 2 mugs of tea. She looked surprised. "You remembered?" A faint smile touched his face. "Trying to." He handed her one carefully before sitting beside her. For several minutes, neither spoke. The silence between them felt different now. Not empty, reflective. Finally, Daniel spoke quietly. "I read something today." Naomi turned slightly. "One of your notebooks." She blinked in surprise. Daniel looked ashamed immediately. "I know I shouldn't have." Naomi waited silently. "I only read a few lines," he admitted. "But..." His voice weakened slightly. "I didn't realize how long you were hurting." Naomi looked out into the dark yard again. "I didn't realize how invisible I'd become either." Daniel's throat tightened. "You were never invisible to me." Naomi gave a soft, sad smile. "That's the thing, Daniel." She looked at him fully now. "You loved me. But you stopped emotionally noticing me." The distinction shattered him all over again. Because love had never disappeared from their marriage. Attention had, presence had, emotional curiosity had. Daniel lowered his eyes. "I don't know how to undo 20 years. Naomi's expression softened with genuine sadness. "You don't undo them." He looked up slowly. "Then what?" Naomi stared at the steam rising from her tea. "You decide whether you're willing to become emotionally honest enough to build something different moving forward." Daniel felt fear immediately. Because changing professionally was easy. Changing routines was manageable. But emotional vulnerability? That required confronting himself in ways he had spent an entire lifetime avoiding. And for the first time, Daniel finally understood something terrifying. Saving his marriage would require far more than loving Naomi. It would require learning how to truly show up emotionally, before there was nothing left between them to save. The following Monday began quietly. But underneath the quiet, something had shifted, not healed. Shifted. Daniel noticed it while standing in the kitchen watching Naomi search for her car keys. For years he would have barely registered moments like this. Morning routines became background noise in his mind long ago. Now he found himself paying attention instinctively. The small crease between her brows when she concentrated, the way she tucked loose curls behind her ear. How tired she still looked sometimes, even while smiling. And perhaps most painfully, how beautiful she remained in ways he had stopped verbally acknowledging years ago. "You left them near the dining table," he said softly. Naomi paused, then looked surprised when she found the keys exactly where he said, "Thanks." Daniel nodded once. A silence followed, but before she could leave, he spoke again. "You look nice today." The words sounded awkward leaving his mouth, not because they were untrue, because it had been so long since he said them naturally. Naomi blinked slightly, then she smiled politely. "Thank you." Polite. Again, that wordless distance. Daniel hated how much that tiny detail hurt. Years ago, compliments from him made her light up immediately. Now they landed carefully, like gifts arriving after too many forgotten birthdays. Naomi grabbed her bag. "I'll be late tonight." "Workshop," I remembered, Daniel said quietly. Something flickered briefly across her face. Not excitement. Recognition, like she noticed he was genuinely trying. "I know," she answered softly before leaving. Daniel stood alone in the kitchen afterward, feeling strangely emotional over a 30-second interaction, because effort felt painfully visible now, and so did the years without it. At work, Daniel found himself distracted again. Marcus noticed immediately. "You look like a man being emotionally humbled," he said, while dropping into the chair across from Daniel's desk. Daniel sighed tiredly. "That obvious?" Marcus laughed. "Very." Daniel leaned back slowly. "I think I'm finally realizing how much Naomi adapted around my absence." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That's what long-term emotional neglect usually looks like." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "She stopped expecting things from me." "That's not peace, Daniel." Marcus's voice softened. "That's survival." The truth landed heavily again. Daniel stared out the office window. "She says she felt emotionally invisible." Marcus was quiet briefly before asking, "Did you ever really let her inconvenience your emotional comfort?" Daniel frowned. "What?" Marcus leaned forward slightly. "I'm serious. Every time Naomi brought you pain, disappointment, loneliness, did you fully sit with it? Or did you immediately try fixing, explaining, or escaping it?" Daniel opened his mouth, then stopped, because suddenly he knew the answer. Marcus nodded slowly. "Most emotionally unavailable people aren't cold, they're uncomfortable." Daniel swallowed hard. That sentence followed him long after Marcus left the office. Uncomfortable, not cruel, not malicious, just emotionally unequipped. And somehow, that truth felt both relieving and devastating, because intentions did not erase consequences. Meanwhile, Naomi sat in the workshop classroom staring at a blank page. Today's assignment was difficult. Write a letter to the version of yourself that stayed too long in emotional pain. The instructor walked quietly between tables while everyone wrote. Naomi stared at the paper for several minutes, before finally beginning. "Dear Naomi, you were never asking for too much. You asked for conversation, attention, emotional presence, tenderness, without reminders. You kept shrinking your needs so someone else wouldn't feel inadequate. And somewhere inside all that patience, you abandoned yourself." Her throat tightened immediately. Across the room, Elliot glanced toward her briefly, noticing the emotion in her face. Naomi kept writing. "You confused endurance with love for too many years. You thought staying silent made you strong. But loneliness whispered through your life so often that eventually silence became your personality." A tear slipped quietly down her cheek. She wiped it quickly before anyone noticed. Except Elliot already had. After class ended, he approached carefully while people packed their things. "That assignment was brutal," he said gently. Naomi laughed softly through lingering emotion. "Yeah, you okay?" She nodded. "Just thinking." Elliot hesitated briefly before speaking again. "You know what I've learned?" "What?" "People who spend years emotionally unseen usually become experts at pretending they're fine." Naomi looked at him carefully. There was no flirtation in his voice, just understanding. And honestly, that almost felt more dangerous, because emotional understanding had become the exact thing missing most deeply from her marriage. That evening, Daniel arrived home carrying flowers. Not because it was an anniversary, not because he forgot something important, just because Naomi liked fresh flowers. At least, she used to. The realization alone made him nervous. What if he no longer knew her well enough to know what she loved? When Naomi entered the kitchen later, she stopped immediately. Flowers rested near the window beside the sink. Simple white tulips. Her favorite. A complicated emotion crossed her face. "You remembered," she said quietly. Daniel looked almost uncertain. Of course I remembered. But the truth was, he hadn't remembered consciously. Not until he stood inside the florist shop for nearly 10 minutes, trying desperately to recall what flowers made her happiest. And the fact that remembering required effort now deeply unsettled him. Naomi touched one of the tulips gently. "They're beautiful." Daniel watched her carefully. Years ago, this gesture would have emotionally overwhelmed her. Now, it simply seemed to make her thoughtful, and somehow that hurt more. "I know flowers don't fix anything," he said quietly. Naomi looked up slowly. "No. But noticing matters." Those words stayed with him all evening. Noticing matters. Such a small sentence. Such enormous truth. Later that night, Naomi sat in bed reading, while Daniel pretended to focus on a financial article beside her. Pretended being the key word. In reality, his thoughts remained entirely on her, on them, on the growing realization that he had spent years loving Naomi passively instead of intentionally. Finally, he lowered the magazine. "Can I ask you something?" Naomi marked her page carefully. "Okay." Daniel hesitated longer than necessary. "When did you stop feeling emotionally safe with me?" Naomi became very still. The question clearly cost him something to ask, and that mattered. She closed her book slowly. "I don't think there was one moment," she admitted softly. "It happened gradually." Daniel listened quietly. "Every time I brought you something vulnerable and felt you pulling away emotionally." She paused. "A part of me stopped trusting the space between us." Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. Naomi continued carefully. "You weren't cruel, Daniel. Honestly, I think that confused me for years." He looked back at her. "What do you mean? You always sounded reasonable." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "You explained everything logically enough that I started questioning whether my loneliness was even valid." Daniel felt shame crawl heavily through his chest, because he remembered doing exactly that. When she complained about distance, he pointed to responsibilities. When she needed emotional closeness, he promised things would calm down later. When she cried, he reassured instead of truly listening. He thought he was helping. God. Naomi's voice softened further. "The hardest relationships to leave emotionally are the ones where nobody seems obviously wrong." Daniel stared at her silently, and for the first time, he fully grasped the depth of what they lost. Not passion, not commitment, emotional trust. Naomi no longer believed her feelings could safely exist inside the marriage without being minimized, explained away, or emotionally postponed. And rebuilding that kind of trust suddenly felt far more fragile than Daniel ever imagined. 2 days later, Ava called Naomi during lunch. "How are things?" she asked carefully. Naomi sat outside a small cafe downtown wrapped in autumn sunlight. "Different. Good different, or scary different?" Naomi smiled faintly. "Both." Ava was quiet briefly. "Dad's trying. He is." "And?" Naomi stared at people walking past the sidewalk. "I don't know what to do with that yet." The honesty surprised even her. Because for years she prayed for effort from Daniel. Now that it existed, part of her remained emotionally guarded anyway. Ava understood immediately. "You don't trust it yet." Naomi exhaled slowly. "No," and saying it out loud filled her with guilt. Because Daniel genuinely was trying now. Listening more, paying attention, being emotionally present in ways she hadn't seen for years. But emotional exhaustion changes people. When someone spends too long emotionally hungry, even tenderness can begin feeling unfamiliar. "What are you afraid of?" Ava asked softly. Naomi looked down at her untouched coffee. "That, I'll start hoping again." The vulnerability in her voice nearly broke Ava's heart, because hope had become dangerous for her mother. Hope meant risking disappointment all over again. And after years of quiet heartbreak, Naomi no longer knew whether she could survive returning emotionally to a marriage that once made her feel invisible. That evening, Daniel found Naomi asleep on the couch. A book rested against her chest, while soft jazz played quietly nearby. He stood still for several moments simply watching her. 20 years. 20 years with the same woman. And somehow, he was only now beginning to understand the emotional depth of her inner world. The realization humbled him painfully. Carefully, he reached down and lifted the book from her hands. Naomi stirred slightly awake. "Sorry," she murmured sleepily. "You don't have to apologize for falling asleep." Her eyes opened slowly. The softness in Daniel's voice caught her off guard. He sat carefully on the edge of the couch. "You used to sleep like this all the time when Ava was little," he said quietly. Naomi blinked in surprise. "You remember that?" Daniel gave a faint, sad smile. "I remember more than you think." A silence settled softly between them. Not tense this time, just tired, honest. Then Daniel spoke again. "You know what scares me most?" Naomi looked at him quietly. "That I spent so long assuming you'd always emotionally stay." His voice weakened slightly. "That I never noticed you were slowly leaving piece by piece." Naomi felt emotion rise unexpectedly inside her chest. Because for the first time in years, Daniel sounded like a man finally grieving the marriage too. Naomi couldn't stop thinking about what Daniel said. "I never noticed you were slowly leaving piece by piece." The sentence followed her for days afterward. Not because it magically repaired anything, but because it sounded painfully honest. And honesty had become rare between them long before either of them admitted it. Thursday evening arrived cold and rainy. Naomi stood in front of the bathroom mirror, getting ready for the writing workshop, while soft music played from her phone nearby. She applied minimal makeup carefully, then paused. For years she dressed without thinking much about herself. Practicality became habit. Comfort became invisibility. But lately, she found herself caring again. Not for attention, not for validation, because reconnecting with herself made her feel emotionally awake in ways she had forgotten were possible. When she walked downstairs, Daniel looked up immediately from the couch, and for a brief second, something crossed his face so openly that Naomi almost looked away. Admiration. Real admiration. "You look beautiful," he said quietly. No hesitation this time. No awkwardness. Just truth. Naomi felt the compliment land somewhere deep and complicated inside her. "Thank you." Daniel stood slowly. "How's the workshop going?" "Good. What are you working on now?" Naomi hesitated briefly before answering. "Emotional memory." Daniel nodded slowly. "That sounds intense." "It is." She reached for her coat. Then, unexpectedly, Daniel asked, "Are you writing about us?" Naomi became still. Some questions carried emotional risk, no matter how gently they were asked. "A little," she admitted. Daniel swallowed subtly. "Am I the villain?" Naomi looked genuinely surprised. "No." The answer came immediately, firmly. And somehow, that affected Daniel more deeply than if she had blamed him completely, because if he were a villain, the problem would have been simpler. Instead, he was something much harder to confront. A good man, who unintentionally caused profound loneliness. Naomi studied him carefully before speaking again. The hardest pain to explain is when someone loves you sincerely but still fails to emotionally meet you. Daniel lowered his eyes quietly, and for the first time, he stopped trying to defend himself against that truth. At the workshop that night, the instructor gave everyone a surprising assignment. "Tonight," she announced, "I want you to write a conversation you wish you'd had years earlier." The room grew quiet immediately. Naomi stared down at her notebook. She already knew which conversation she would write, the one she never fully allowed herself to have with Daniel, because, deep down, she feared honesty would make him emotionally retreat further. Her pen moved slowly. "Daniel, I don't need perfection from you. I need presence. I need to feel like my inner world matters to you, even when it's inconvenient, emotional, or difficult to fix. I need to stop feeling guilty for wanting closeness. I need to know I can bring my sadness to you without feeling like another responsibility on your already crowded list." Naomi stopped writing abruptly when emotion tightened her throat. Beside her, Elliot remained quietly focused on his own notebook. For several minutes nobody spoke. Then the instructor said softly, "Most relationships don't collapse from lack of love. They collapse from accumulated emotional disconnection left unspoken too long." Naomi closed her eyes briefly, because that sentence felt like someone describing her marriage directly. After class ended, Elliot walked beside her toward the parking lot again. Cold air wrapped around them, while leaves scattered across the pavement. "You seem heavier tonight," he observed gently. Naomi gave a small laugh. "Am I that obvious?" "Only to people paying attention." The words landed unexpectedly hard. People paying attention. That was the entire wound, wasn't it? They reached her car. Elliot hesitated briefly before speaking. "You know, healing relationships requires two people willing to become uncomfortable." Naomi looked at him carefully. "And if one person changes too late?" Elliot's expression softened sadly. "Then both people usually grieve what the relationship could have been." The answer stayed with her all the way home. Meanwhile, Daniel sat alone in the living room, unable to focus on anything. The television played unnoticed in the background while his thoughts circled endlessly around Naomi. Around regret. Around missed moments. Around how easily he once assumed their marriage was secure simply because they stayed together. Now he understood something painful. Physical permanence and emotional intimacy are not the same thing. A marriage can survive structurally while quietly dying emotionally underneath. His phone buzzed suddenly. "Marcus, you alive?" Daniel stared at the message before replying, "Barely." A few seconds later, Marcus called immediately. "That bad?" Daniel rubbed his forehead tiredly. "I think I spent 20 years emotionally sleepwalking through my marriage." Marcus was quiet briefly. "That realization hurts." "Yeah." Daniel leaned back heavily against the couch. "She used to tell me everything. And now? Now I feel like I'm meeting parts of my wife I should have known all along." Marcus sighed softly. "You know what emotionally neglected people eventually learn? What? How to live without needing the connection they once begged for." Daniel closed his eyes immediately, because that was exactly what terrified him most. Naomi no longer chased him emotionally. No more pleading. No more repeated disappointment. No more desperate attempts to reconnect. Instead, she was slowly building a life emotionally independent from him. And Daniel had no idea whether he arrived too late to stop it. Naomi entered the house quietly around 9:30 p.m. She expected darkness. Instead, she found soft music playing in the kitchen. Daniel stood near the stove stirring something carefully. She looked genuinely confused. "You cooked again?" Daniel glanced back sheepishly. "I watched 3 tutorials first this time." Despite herself, Naomi smiled. "What is it?" "Soup." "That sounds safer than risotto." "That's exactly what the internet said." A soft laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Daniel looked at her carefully, noticing again how beautiful her laughter remained. How long had he gone without protecting moments like that? "You hungry?" he asked. "A little." They ate together quietly at the kitchen island. The soup was actually decent. Naomi looked mildly impressed. "This is good." Daniel smiled faintly. "Don't sound so shocked." "I'm shocked because you once burned pasta." "That happened one time." "Twice." Daniel laughed softly under his breath. The sound startled both of them slightly, because easy moments between them had become so rare lately. Then slowly, the conversation faded again. Not awkward exactly, just careful. Naomi stared down at her bowl before speaking quietly. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel nodded immediately. "Anything." "Why now?" The question landed softly but heavily. Daniel understood exactly what she meant. Why the effort now? Why the attention now? Why the emotional honesty now, after years of distance? He exhaled slowly. "Because I finally saw what losing you emotionally actually looked like." Naomi looked at him silently. Daniel's voice lowered. "And it terrified me." The honesty in his face unsettled her deeply. No defensiveness, no polished explanation, just fear. "I thought we were stable," he admitted quietly. "I didn't realize stability and emotional connection were becoming two completely different things." Naomi swallowed hard. "You really didn't know?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "I knew we were distant." His eyes lowered briefly. "I just didn't understand how deeply lonely you'd become." Naomi looked away immediately toward the rain-covered windows, because part of her still struggled emotionally with that reality. How could someone sleep beside you for 20 years and not fully see your loneliness? Daniel continued softly. "You know what hurts most?" She looked back at him. "That you were carrying all this pain while still trying to protect me from feeling like a failure." The truth of it nearly made Naomi emotional, because, yes, she had protected him, softened conversations, minimized hurt, accepted crumbs of emotional attention so he wouldn't feel overwhelmed. And in doing so, she slowly disappeared inside herself. Daniel's voice weakened slightly. "I think you loved me harder than I knew how to receive." Silence filled the kitchen immediately afterward. Naomi stared at him in stunned stillness. Because that sentence reached somewhere painfully deep. Daniel looked equally affected by his own words. Like he had finally uncovered a truth buried beneath years of emotional avoidance. Naomi's eyes filled quietly. Not because everything was fixed, but because for the first time in years, she felt emotionally heard without needing to fight for it first. And somehow, that almost hurt more than the loneliness itself. Sometimes, the most painful relationships are not the ones filled with hatred. They're the ones filled with love that was never fully expressed the right way. Tonight's chapter reminds us that emotional neglect rarely happens overnight. It happens slowly, through missed conversations, unnoticed loneliness, and years of assuming there will always be more time. If this story is touching your heart so far, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and turn on notifications so you never miss another emotional journey like this one. And I want you to answer this honestly in the comments. Can love survive after years of emotional distance? Or does the heart eventually stop waiting? Your stories and opinions matter here. Now, let's continue. The next few weeks unfolded slowly, not dramatically, not magically. Healing, Naomi was learning, did not arrive through one emotional conversation and suddenly erase years of loneliness. But something undeniable had changed between them. Daniel was paying attention now, really paying attention. He noticed when she seemed emotionally tired, remembered details from conversations, asked questions without immediately trying to solve everything afterward. At first, Naomi didn't know what to do with it. Part of her softened instinctively. Another part remained deeply cautious. Because hope after disappointment feels dangerous, especially when you spent years teaching yourself not to expect too much. One Friday evening, Naomi returned home carrying groceries, and stopped in surprise the moment she entered the kitchen. Daniel stood at the counter setting candles onto the dining table awkwardly. Not fancy candles, simple white ones from the grocery store. Still, the effort itself startled her. "What's all this?" she asked carefully. Daniel looked mildly embarrassed. "I thought maybe we could have dinner without phones tonight." Naomi blinked slowly. For years she begged for small things exactly like this. Unrushed dinners, conversations without distractions, moments that felt emotionally intentional. Now here he was trying to create them on his own. The realization stirred both warmth and grief simultaneously. Because effort arriving late still reminds you how long you lived without it. "You cooked?" she asked. Daniel winced slightly. "I ordered." Naomi laughed softly despite herself. Probably wise. Something eased visibly in his face hearing her laugh again. God, he missed that sound. More than he could explain. Dinner was simple. Italian takeout. Soft jazz, playing quietly. rain against the windows again. But what mattered wasn't the food. It was attention. Daniel stayed emotionally present the entire evening. No emails. No distracted glances at his phone. No mental drifting toward work. Just presence. And strangely, Naomi realized she had forgotten how powerful genuine attention could feel inside a marriage. At one point, Daniel asked softly, "What's something you miss about yourself?" The question caught her completely off guard. Naomi looked down slowly at her wineglass. "No one's asked me that in a long time." Daniel's expression tightened faintly. That wasn't a compliment. She thought carefully before answering. "I miss how emotionally open I used to be." Daniel stayed quiet, listening. "I used to say exactly what I felt." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "Before I started worrying whether my emotions would overwhelm everyone." Daniel felt guilt move sharply through his chest, because he knew exactly who taught her that fear. Naomi continued quietly. "I think after enough disappointment, people stop expressing themselves fully, because protecting their heart becomes more important than being understood." Daniel stared at her silently. The frightening thing was how emotionally wise her loneliness had made her, and how absent he had been while she developed that wisdom alone. The following Tuesday, Naomi stayed after class talking with Elliot, while the rest of the workshop slowly emptied out. Tonight's topic had centered around identity, who people become inside long relationships. What parts survive? What parts disappear? "You were quiet tonight," Elliot observed gently, while stacking papers into his bag. Naomi smiled faintly. "I was thinking too much." "Dangerous hobby." She laughed softly. Then, her expression turned thoughtful again. "Can I ask you something honestly?" "Sure." Naomi hesitated briefly. "Do you think people can really change emotionally at this stage in life?" Elliot leaned back against the desk, considering the question carefully. "I think people can become more honest," he said finally. Naomi listened closely. "And honesty changes things?" "Sometimes." He shrugged slightly. "Most people spend their lives avoiding themselves. Real emotional change usually starts when avoidance becomes more painful than self-awareness." The answer settled heavily inside her. Because Daniel did seem different lately. Not performative, not temporary. Honest. And honesty frightened her almost as much as distance once did. Because if he truly changed, then she would have to decide whether she could emotionally trust him again. That terrified her. Elliot studied her quietly for a second. "You still love him very much." Naomi looked startled. "Is it obvious?" "Only to people paying attention." Again, that phrase. People paying attention. She looked away briefly. "I don't know if love is enough anymore." Elliot nodded slowly. "That's usually what happens after emotional neglect." His voice softened. "The love survives longer than the trust." Naomi felt that truth immediately. Exactly. That was the real wound. Not absence of love. Absence of emotional safety. Meanwhile, Daniel sat inside a therapist's office for the first time in his life. The decision itself felt surreal. He almost cancelled twice. Dr. Rebecca Lang sat across from him calmly while he struggled to explain why he came. Finally, he exhaled heavily and admitted, "I think I emotionally failed my wife without realizing it." Rebecca didn't rush to comfort him. "That sounds important," she said gently. Daniel rubbed his hands together nervously. "She says I stopped seeing her. And do you think she's right?" Daniel's silence stretched long enough to answer. Rebecca leaned slightly forward. "Tell me how love was modeled for you, growing up." Daniel laughed quietly, without humor. "There wasn't much modeling." "Explain." "My father worked constantly. My mother handled emotions." He shrugged faintly. "As long as bills were paid and nobody abandoned the family, everything was considered fine." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "And vulnerability?" Daniel almost smiled. That wasn't really a thing. The conversation continued slowly, carefully, painfully. For the first time in years, Daniel was forced to confront truths he spent a lifetime avoiding. How deeply he tied self-worth to usefulness. How uncomfortable emotions made him feel. How often he withdrew psychologically whenever Naomi needed emotional closeness he didn't know how to provide. Rebecca asked quietly, "What scares you most about emotional vulnerability?" Daniel answered immediately this time, "That I'll fail." The honesty surprised even him. Rebecca nodded slowly. "So, instead of risking emotional inadequacy," she paused carefully, "you focused on being indispensable practically." Daniel stared at the floor. God, that was exactly what happened. He spent 20 years becoming professionally reliable while emotionally unavailable. And somehow, he convinced himself those two things balanced each other out. They didn't. That night, Naomi sat in bed reading when Daniel entered the room unusually late. He looked emotionally exhausted. More emotionally open than exhausted physically. "You okay?" she asked softly. Daniel loosened his tie slowly. "I went to therapy." Naomi froze. "What?" He looked strangely uncomfortable saying it aloud. "I had a session after work." Naomi stared at him carefully. Daniel Mercer hated emotional exposure. The fact that he voluntarily entered therapy felt almost impossible to imagine 6 months ago. How was it? She asked quietly. Daniel sat at the edge of the bed. Hard. A long silence followed. Then unexpectedly he admitted, I think I've spent most of my life avoiding emotional vulnerability, because I associated it with weakness. Naomi closed her book slowly. This conversation felt important. Daniel looked down at his hands. My father used to say, men solve problems. They don't sit around talking about feelings. He gave a faint, tired laugh. Turns out that mindset slowly destroys intimacy. Naomi felt emotion tighten unexpectedly inside her chest. Not because therapy instantly fixed anything, but because Daniel was finally tracing his emotional distance back to its roots, instead of just apologizing for the symptoms. And that mattered deeply. What made you go? She asked softly. Daniel looked at her fully then. The possibility of losing you emotionally terrified me enough to stop avoiding myself. The honesty in his face nearly broke her heart. Because she believed him. And that was dangerous. Very dangerous. Hope had already hurt her once before. Naomi looked away toward the window. You know what's strange? She whispered. What? I spent years begging internally for this version of you. Her voice weakened slightly. And now that he's finally here, I don't fully know how to trust him yet. Daniel absorbed the words quietly. No defensiveness. No wounded pride. Just understanding. You don't have to trust me immediately, he said softly. I think I'm only starting to understand how long you've been carrying this alone. Tears burned unexpectedly behind Naomi's eyes, because that sentence was the closest she had felt to emotionally understood in years. And somehow, after everything, part of her still loved him enough to ache over it. For the first time in years, Daniel began noticing how often Naomi apologized unnecessarily. Sorry, I forgot to thaw the chicken. Sorry, I'm tired. Sorry, I forgot what day your meeting was. Tiny apologies. Constant apologies. The kind spoken by someone who spent years trying not to become emotionally inconvenient. Once he noticed it, he couldn't stop noticing, and every time it happened, guilt settled deeper inside him. Because Naomi had slowly learned to make herself emotionally smaller around him. Not because he demanded it directly. Because his emotional unavailability taught her there was rarely enough room for her full feelings. One Wednesday evening, Daniel arrived home earlier than expected. He found Naomi sitting cross-legged on the living room floor surrounded by pages from the workshop. She looked so absorbed in her writing that she didn't hear him immediately. Daniel stood quietly watching her for a moment. There was something beautiful about seeing her fully engaged with herself again. Alive, focused, emotionally present, and painful too. Because he realized how long she had existed in survival mode instead of joy. Naomi finally looked up. Oh, you're home early. Daniel smiled faintly. You didn't hear me come in. You scared me. Sorry. There it was again. That reflexive apology. Daniel walked closer slowly. What are you working on? Naomi hesitated briefly before answering. A piece about emotional loneliness. His chest tightened immediately. Can I ask something? Okay. Daniel sat carefully on the couch nearby. When did you start feeling lonely with me? Naomi looked down at the papers scattered around her. The question clearly cost him something to ask. She decided to answer honestly. I think it started after Ava was born. Daniel blinked in surprise. That long ago? Naomi nodded softly. You worked constantly back then. I was trying to provide. I know. And she did know. That was always the complicated part. Daniel's intentions were rarely selfish. But good intentions did not prevent emotional abandonment. Naomi folded one page carefully before continuing. I remember being exhausted all the time. Ava barely slept. I barely slept. A faint, sad smile crossed her face. And you were physically there, but mentally somewhere else most days. Daniel lowered his eyes slowly. God, he remembered that period completely differently. He thought they were a team surviving difficult years together. He never realized Naomi felt emotionally alone inside them. I should have noticed, he whispered. Naomi's expression softened slightly. You were overwhelmed too. But you still noticed me. The truth of that settled heavily between them. Because even during her exhaustion, Naomi paid emotional attention to him constantly. She noticed stress in his posture, fatigue in his face, pressure in his voice. Meanwhile, Daniel missed entire emotional seasons of her life. The imbalance hurt him deeply now that he could finally see it clearly. The next therapy session left Daniel emotionally raw. Dr. Rebecca leaned back thoughtfully after listening to him describe Naomi's loneliness. You keep describing yourself as someone who loved his wife, she observed carefully. I did love her. I believe you. She paused. But I think you viewed love primarily as responsibility, rather than emotional participation. Daniel sat quietly. That sentence felt painfully accurate. Rebecca continued gently. When Naomi brought emotions into the relationship, what did you usually feel internally? Daniel frowned slightly. Pressure. Explain that. I felt responsible for fixing it. He rubbed his jaw slowly. And when I couldn't fix it quickly, I felt inadequate. Rebecca nodded. So instead of sitting with the emotional discomfort, she tilted her head slightly. You retreated into what you knew how to succeed at. Work. Yes. Daniel exhaled heavily. The pattern suddenly looked obvious from the outside. Every time emotional intimacy demanded vulnerability from him, he unconsciously escaped toward productivity and competence instead. And Naomi paid the emotional price for that avoidance year after year. What's difficult, Rebecca said softly, is that emotionally neglected partners often stop asking for what they need long before the other person notices. There's a serious problem. Daniel stared at the floor quietly. That was exactly what happened. By the time he recognized Naomi's emotional distance, she had already spent years grieving privately. Meanwhile, Naomi attended another workshop session focused on emotional truth in storytelling. The instructor paced slowly at the front of the room. The strongest writing, she explained, comes from the things people are afraid to admit aloud. Naomi immediately thought, I still want my marriage to survive. Even after everything, even after the loneliness, even after teaching herself emotionally not to hope anymore. Part of her still loved Daniel deeply enough to want healing, and that frightened her, because wanting something again means risking disappointment again. After class, Elliot approached while she packed her notebook away. You seem somewhere else tonight. Naomi smiled faintly. I think too much. Occupational hazard of emotionally aware people. She laughed softly. Then, unexpectedly, she asked, Can I tell you something honest? Sure. Naomi hesitated. I think my husband is changing. Elliot listened quietly. And that scares you? Not a question. Naomi nodded slowly. For years, I begged internally for emotional connection. She swallowed carefully. Now he's finally trying, and I don't know whether I can emotionally survive believing in it again. Elliot leaned against the desk thoughtfully. You know what rebuilding trust usually requires? What? Consistency long enough to make the nervous system believe the pain won't repeat itself. The words settled deeply inside her, because that was exactly the problem. Her heart wanted softness. Her nervous system expected disappointment. Those two things were exhausting to carry at the same time. Elliot gave her a small, understanding smile. People don't heal emotionally at the same speed they were hurt. Naomi nearly cried hearing that, because finally, someone understood why effort alone wasn't immediately enough anymore. That Friday night, Ava visited unexpectedly. The moment she entered the house, she noticed the difference immediately. Not perfection. Presence. Her parents actually sat near each other in the living room, instead of disappearing into separate corners of the house. The tension remained, but so did effort. Well, Ava said dramatically while dropping onto the couch, either you two are reconciling, or somebody joined a cult. Naomi laughed softly while Daniel rolled his eyes. It's called communication, Daniel muttered. Ava stared in mock amazement. Wow. Huge breakthrough. Even Daniel laughed quietly at that. And Naomi noticed something important in that moment. Laughter no longer felt impossible between them. Fragile, yes, but possible. Later that evening, Ava helped Naomi wash dishes while Daniel cleaned the living room. You seem lighter, Ava whispered gently. Naomi stared down at the warm water. I think your father's finally learning how to emotionally stay in uncomfortable conversations. That's big for him. It is. Ava hesitated briefly. Do you believe him? Naomi became quiet. Then finally I believe he means it. That's not the same thing. No, Naomi admitted softly. It isn't. Ava dried another plate slowly. Mom, are you afraid to need him again? The question hit painfully close. Because yes, that was exactly it. Naomi spent years surviving emotional disappointment by needing less. Now Daniel's effort threatened to reopen parts of her heart she had carefully shut down for self-protection. And vulnerability after emotional neglect feels terrifying. I don't know how to trust consistency yet, Naomi admitted quietly. Ava wrapped an arm around her shoulders gently. That makes sense. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. For years, she thought healing meant finally receiving the love she needed. Now she was discovering something harder. Healing also meant allowing herself to emotionally believe in it again. That night, Daniel found Naomi sitting alone in the backyard, wrapped in a blanket staring up at the stars. Cold autumn air surrounded her softly. He approached slowly carrying 2 mugs of tea. You're becoming predictable, Naomi said quietly as he handed her one. Daniel smiled faintly. I'm trying to become dependable emotionally. The sentence startled both of them slightly because it sounded simple, but emotionally, it meant everything. Daniel sat beside her. For several minutes neither spoke, then finally he asked softly, What are you thinking about? Naomi stared upward, How strange it is to mourn a marriage while still being inside it. Daniel felt those words deeply, because he had finally started mourning too. Not just the possibility of losing her, the years they lost emotionally while living side by side pretending everything was okay. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Naomi looked at him gently. "I know." "No." His voice weakened slightly. "I don't think you understand yet." She stayed quiet. Daniel looked down into his tea. "I'm not sorry because you're upset now." He swallowed carefully. "I'm sorry because I finally understand how long you were carrying this pain alone, while I kept telling myself we had time." Emotion rose visibly in Naomi's eyes, because that sentence carried something different from apology. Awareness. Real awareness. Daniel looked at her fully, then, "I think part of me assumed your love for me was permanent, no matter how emotionally absent I became." The honesty almost took her breath away, because yes, that was exactly how it felt, like he unconsciously trusted her devotion more than he protected it. Naomi's voice softened almost to a whisper. "And now?" Daniel's eyes filled quietly for the first time in years. "Now I understand love can survive neglect longer than trust can." Winter arrived slowly. The trees outside their homes stood bare now, branches stretching against pale grey skies, while cold winds swept through Connecticut mornings. And somehow, despite everything fragile between them, the house no longer felt emotionally dead, not healed, but awake again. Daniel noticed it in small moments. The way Naomi lingered slightly longer during conversations, the way laughter occasionally returned without feeling forced, the way silence no longer automatically meant emotional distance. Still, trust remained careful, like something recovering from injury. One careless movement, and it could retreat all over again. Daniel understood that now. Healing wasn't about grand gestures. It was about consistency. And consistency required patience strong enough to survive discomfort. One Saturday morning, Naomi stood in the kitchen reading workshop feedback while Daniel made breakfast. Real breakfast this time. Not burned. Progress. "You're smiling," he observed, while flipping pancakes carefully. Naomi looked up. "My instructor liked my essay." "That's great." She hesitated briefly before adding, "She thinks I should submit something for publication." Daniel turned immediately. "Seriously?" Naomi nodded slowly. For years she would have hidden news like this from him automatically. Not because he forbade her dreams, because she stopped expecting emotional enthusiasm from him. Daniel walked toward her without hesitation. "That's incredible, Naomi." The sincerity in his face startled her slightly. "You really think so?" "Yes." He looked genuinely confused by the question. "Why wouldn't I?" Naomi's expression softened sadly. Because once upon a time she would have asked that question internally every single day. "Why doesn't my excitement emotionally matter here?" Daniel slowly realized what passed through her face. His chest tightened. "How many moments like this did I miss?" he asked quietly. Naomi lowered her eyes. "A lot." The honesty hurt. But unlike before, Daniel no longer defended himself against the pain. He let it sit there honestly between them. And, strangely, that was beginning to rebuild something. Later that afternoon, Daniel attended therapy again. This session focused on emotional intimacy. Rebecca listened carefully while Daniel described recent changes between him and Naomi. "It sounds like you're becoming more emotionally present," she observed. "I'm trying." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "What have you learned so far?" Daniel leaned back slowly. "That emotional connection isn't maintained automatically." He paused. "I think I treated marriage like something stable enough to survive neglect indefinitely." Rebecca tilted her head slightly. "And now?" "Now I think love requires attention the same way living things require water." The metaphor surprised even him. Rebecca smiled faintly. "That's emotionally insightful." Daniel laughed quietly. "Naomi would faint hearing you say that." Rebecca smiled too before asking gently, "What still scares you most?" Daniel answered honestly this time, "That even if I change, I may have hurt her too deeply already." Rebecca was silent briefly. "Do you know what emotionally neglected people usually need most before trust returns?" Daniel shook his head. "Emotional predictability." The phrase settled heavily into his mind. Rebecca continued softly. "When someone spends years feeling emotionally unseen, their nervous system adapts around disappointment. Consistency matters more than intensity." Daniel absorbed the words carefully. Consistency, not intensity, not dramatic speeches, not sudden romance, reliable emotional presence over time. He could do that. At least, he hoped he could. Meanwhile, Naomi sat in a bookstore cafe downtown, editing one of her workshop essays. Snow drifted softly outside the windows while quiet piano music played overhead. Her phone buzzed unexpectedly. "Daniel." She stared at the screen briefly before answering. "Hey, hi." His voice sounded warm. "You busy?" "Not really." A pause. Then, "I was thinking about something you said." Naomi leaned back slightly. "Okay." You said you spent years feeling emotionally alone beside me. His voice lowered carefully, and I realized today I never really asked what that loneliness actually felt like. Naomi became very still, because he was right. He hadn't, not deeply, not without immediately moving toward guilt or apology afterward. Now he sounded genuinely curious, emotionally curious. What did it feel like? He asked softly. Naomi stared out at the falling snow. The question reached somewhere deep inside her. Finally, she answered quietly. It felt like grieving privately, while pretending everything was okay publicly. Daniel stayed silent on the other end. So, she continued, it felt like constantly translating my emotional needs into smaller, easier versions so you wouldn't feel overwhelmed. Her throat tightened slightly. It felt lonely sitting beside someone I still loved deeply. Silence. Then quietly, I'm sorry. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. The difference now was that his apologies no longer sounded like attempts to end the discomfort quickly. They sounded like someone finally allowing himself to emotionally witness the damage fully, and, somehow, that mattered more than she expected. That evening, Ava video-called both of them unexpectedly. You two look weird, she announced immediately. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? You look emotionally healthier. It's suspicious. Naomi laughed softly. There's still time for disaster. Good. Ava nodded dramatically. Wouldn't want you becoming one of those couples who hold hands at farmers markets. Daniel groaned while Naomi smiled into her tea. The ease of the moment surprised all three of them slightly, not because problems disappeared, but because emotional tension no longer consumed every interaction. At one point, Ava studied her parents quietly through the screen. You know, she said softly, this feels more honest. Naomi looked at her carefully. What does? You two. Daniel blinked slightly. Ava shrugged. Before, everything looked stable. But emotionally, it always felt like you were both holding your breath. The accuracy stunned them into silence. Because yes, that was exactly how the marriage used to feel. Controlled, functional, emotionally restrained. Now the conversations were harder sometimes, more vulnerable, more uncomfortable, but also more alive. Ava smiled gently. I think this is the first time I've ever seen both of you emotionally present at the same time. Those words stayed with Daniel long after the call ended. Emotionally present at the same time. Such a simple concept. Yet somehow, they had spent years missing it completely. A few days later, Naomi received an email. Her essay had been accepted for publication in a small literary magazine. She stared at the screen in stunned silence. For several seconds, she simply sat there processing it. Then, instinctively, before even fully thinking, she reached for her phone to call Daniel. The realization hit her halfway through dialing. She paused suddenly, because for years, exciting moments automatically became private experiences, not because Daniel didn't love her, because she stopped expecting emotional availability from him. And yet, here she was calling him first anyway. The awareness unsettled her deeply. Daniel answered almost immediately. Hey, everything okay? Naomi laughed softly in disbelief. Actually, something good happened. His voice changed instantly. What? My essay got accepted. A beat of silence. Then, Naomi. The pride in his voice sounded so genuine that tears burned unexpectedly behind her eyes. That's amazing. She swallowed carefully. Yeah, no, seriously. She could hear him smiling now. That's incredible. I'm proud of you. Proud. Such a small word. Such enormous emotional impact when you spent years emotionally unseen. Naomi looked down quickly, overwhelmed by how much the moment affected her. Daniel softened immediately, hearing the emotion in her silence. You deserved this, he said quietly. And suddenly, Naomi realized something painful. Part of her still desperately wanted emotional partnership with him, not because she needed validation, because shared joy matters deeply in love. And for years, she had stopped believing shared emotional experiences were possible between them anymore. That night, Daniel brought home champagne. Cheap champagne. Slightly terrible champagne. But Naomi laughed the moment she saw it. You hate champagne. I know, Daniel admitted. But apparently people celebrate with this. She shook her head, smiling. You're ridiculous. And you got published. They stood together in the kitchen while snow fell softly outside. Daniel poured 2 glasses carefully. Then he looked at her for a long moment before speaking. You know what I realized today? Naomi raised an eyebrow slightly. What? You called me first. The observation immediately softened her expression. Because she realized it too. Daniel's voice lowered gently. That meant more to me than you probably understand. Naomi stared down into her glass. I didn't even think about it. I know. That was exactly why it mattered. Instinct. Emotional instinct. For the first time in years, some part of Naomi emotionally reached toward him automatically again. The realization filled Daniel with cautious hope. Not certainty, not victory, just hope. And hope felt fragile enough to handle carefully now. Naomi looked at him quietly. "I'm scared," she admitted suddenly. Daniel's expression softened immediately. "Of what?" "That I'll start trusting this version of us, and lose it again." The honesty in her voice nearly broke him, because her fear made complete sense. Daniel stepped slightly closer. "You know what I'm scared of?" She shook her head slowly. "That I'll spend the rest of my life wishing I had learned how to emotionally love you properly sooner." Silence filled the kitchen softly after that. Snow falling, tea lights flickering, 20 years of history standing quietly between them. Then, slowly, for the first time in a very long time, Naomi reached for his hand first. Daniel barely moved after Naomi took his hand. The moment felt fragile enough to break under too much attention. Her fingers rested carefully in his, warm and uncertain, while snow continued drifting softly outside the kitchen windows. 20 years together. And somehow, this small gesture felt more emotionally intimate than dozens of anniversaries they had sleepwalked through before. Not because the marriage was suddenly healed, because trust was beginning to breathe again. Carefully, slowly, honestly, Naomi looked down briefly, almost embarrassed by her own vulnerability. Daniel understood immediately. For years she trained herself not to emotionally reach for him first, and now her instincts were slowly changing again. That terrified her. It terrified him too. So instead of speaking too quickly, Daniel simply held her hand gently and stayed present inside the silence. No rushing, no overpromising, no desperate attempt to force reassurance into the moment, just presence. And, strangely, that was exactly what Naomi needed most. A week later, Naomi attended a small reading event hosted by the workshop. Nothing major, just students sharing selected pieces aloud inside a warmly lit bookstore cafe. Still, she felt nervous standing near the back of the room, clutching printed pages in slightly trembling hands. "You look like you're about to flee the country," Elliot whispered beside her. Naomi laughed quietly. "I hate public speaking. You're a writer. You people fear eye contact professionally." She smiled despite herself. Then suddenly her expression shifted, because Daniel had just walked in. He spotted her immediately. Not distracted, not checking his phone, not mentally somewhere else, fully present. And the look on his face when he saw her standing there, proud, soft, emotionally attentive, nearly unraveled her. Daniel approached carefully. "You didn't think I'd miss this, did you?" Naomi stared at him quietly for a second before answering. "A few months ago? Maybe." The honesty landed gently but heavily. Daniel nodded once. "I know. No defensiveness anymore." That still surprised her sometimes. The reading began shortly afterward. Naomi sat stiffly in her chair waiting for her turn while voices filled the small cafe, one after another. Stories about grief, identity, regret, second chances. Then, finally, Naomi Mercer. Her stomach tightened instantly. Daniel looked toward her with immediate encouragement. "You've got this," he whispered softly. Naomi walked toward the microphone feeling strangely emotional already. Not because she feared reading, because Daniel was actually here, listening, present. The essay she chose was titled, "The Quiet Ways People Leave Each Other." The room fell silent as she began reading. Most people imagine heartbreak as something loud, doors slamming, voices raised, promises shattered dramatically. But sometimes heartbreak sounds like someone saying, "I'm listening," while never truly hearing you. Sometimes it looks like eating dinner beside the person you love, while emotionally grieving them at the same time. Daniel felt every word physically. Naomi continued steadily, despite the emotion building in her chest. Emotional neglect is confusing because love still exists inside it. That's what makes people stay so long. You keep believing love alone should eventually become enough. The cafe remained completely silent. Naomi looked down briefly at the final paragraph before reading softer now. "The loneliest people are often the most understanding. They explain away disappointment, minimize their own pain, wait patiently for emotional connection to return, until one day, they stop waiting." When she finished, quiet applause filled the room, but Naomi barely heard it, because her eyes had already found Daniel, and he looked devastated, not embarrassed, not defensive, heartbroken, as if hearing her loneliness spoken aloud finally forced him to emotionally confront the full reality of what she endured beside him. Afterward, while people mingled around the cafe, Daniel approached her slowly. "You really felt all that?" he asked quietly. Naomi's eyes softened sadly. "Yes." Daniel looked down briefly. Then, "I don't think I'll ever fully forgive myself for not seeing it sooner." The pain in his voice startled her. Naomi touched his arm gently. "Daniel." "No." He shook his head slowly. "You spent years emotionally starving while still loving me enough to stay." Emotion tightened visibly in his throat, and I genuinely thought we were okay. Naomi's chest ached watching him finally grieve honestly. Because part of healing was painful for both of them now, not just her. Later that night, they drove home through softly falling snow. The car remained quiet for several minutes. Then, unexpectedly, Daniel spoke. "You know what scared me most, hearing your essay?" Naomi looked over carefully. "What?" "That." I recognized myself in every line. The honesty settled heavily between them. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "I used to think emotional neglect required cruelty." His voice lowered. "But listening to you tonight made me realize neglect can happen through distraction, postponement, and emotional avoidance too." Naomi looked down quietly. "Yes." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I spent years believing love meant staying committed." He shook his head faintly. "I didn't understand. It also meant remaining emotionally awake." The sentence lingered between them all the way home. Emotionally awake. That was exactly what had been missing. A few days later, Naomi visited Elaine again. Her mother immediately noticed the difference. "You look emotional," Elaine observed, while setting teacups onto the table. Naomi laughed softly. "That obvious?" "To your mother?" "Yes." They sat together near the window while winter sunlight filled the kitchen softly. After a long silence, Naomi admitted, "I think Daniel's really changing." Elaine studied her carefully. "And how does that make you feel?" Naomi stared into her tea. "Hopeful." She paused. "And angry." Elaine nodded slowly, like she expected that answer. "Because it took so long?" "Yes." The word came out sharper than Naomi intended. Emotion rose unexpectedly behind her eyes. "I spent years begging internally for emotional closeness," she whispered. "Now, suddenly he understands?" Elaine reached for her hand gently. "That grief is real too." Naomi blinked quickly. "What do you mean?" "People think reconciliation erases pain." Elaine's voice softened. "But sometimes healing a relationship also means grieving all the years you needed this version of someone and didn't receive it." Tears slipped quietly down Naomi's cheeks. Because yes, that was exactly the ache she couldn't fully explain. Even while reconnecting with Daniel, part of her mourned the younger woman who waited so long to feel emotionally chosen. Elaine squeezed her hand softly. "You're allowed to love him and grieve simultaneously." The permission in those words loosened something inside Naomi she didn't realize she still held tightly. That evening, Daniel sat alone in the living room rereading one of Naomi's published essays online. He had already read it 3 times. Not because he didn't understand it, because he was trying to understand her, really understand her, and perhaps for the first time in 20 years, he was emotionally listening without centering himself first. The front door opened softly. Naomi stepped inside carrying grocery bags. Daniel immediately stood to help her. "Thanks." He carried the bags into the kitchen before turning toward her carefully. "I read your essay again." Naomi froze slightly. "Oh." Daniel leaned against the counter quietly. "There's a line I can't stop thinking about." She waited. "You wrote, 'Some people become emotionally lonely because they keep translating their pain into forms that won't inconvenience others.'" Naomi looked down immediately. Daniel's voice weakened slightly. "Did you really do that for years?" The question held no defensiveness now, only sorrow. Naomi answered honestly, "Yes." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, because suddenly he understood something devastating. Naomi wasn't emotionally needy. She had actually spent most of the marriage minimizing herself to protect him from emotional discomfort. And he still failed to meet her halfway. When he looked at her again, emotion filled his face openly now. "I don't think you were ever asking for too much." Naomi felt her throat tighten instantly, because that sentence healed something quietly wounded inside her for years. Not completely, but enough to hurt. Daniel stepped closer slowly. "You were asking for emotional partnership." His voice softened. "I just didn't know how to give it." Silence settled gently between them, and for the first time in a very long time, Naomi no longer felt emotionally invisible standing in front of her husband. The closer they grew again, the more complicated healing became. That surprised both of them. For a while, emotional distance had been easier in certain ways. Predictable, numb, controlled. But intimacy? Intimacy reopened everything. The grief, the regret, the years lost quietly inside the same house. Now that Daniel was emotionally present, Naomi found herself remembering old disappointments more vividly instead of less. Not because she wanted to punish him, because safety allows buried pain to finally surface. One rainy Thursday evening, Daniel found Naomi crying quietly in the laundry room. The sight stopped him instantly. She sat on the floor beside the dryer, holding a folded towel against her chest, while tears slipped silently down her face. "Naomi?" She looked up quickly, startled. "I'm okay." But her voice cracked badly. Daniel immediately knelt beside her. "What happened?" Naomi wiped her face quickly. "Nothing." Months ago, Daniel might have accepted that answer out of discomfort. Now he stayed. Quietly, patiently. "Talk to me," he said softly. Naomi shook her head. It's stupid. It's not stupid if it hurts. The gentleness in his voice almost made her cry harder. For several seconds, she struggled to speak. Then finally, I found one of Ava's baby blankets. Daniel glanced toward the towel in her hands. Recognition crossed his face immediately. Oh, Naomi laughed weakly through tears. I suddenly remembered how lonely I was back then. The confession shattered him quietly. Daniel sat down beside her on the floor. Naomi stared ahead while speaking softly. You worked all the time, Ava cried constantly. I barely slept. Her voice trembled slightly, and I remember sitting right here one night feeling completely invisible. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. God, while he remembered those years as difficult but meaningful. Naomi remembered surviving them emotionally alone. I should have been there, he whispered. You were physically there. The distinction hurt, because it was true. Naomi continued carefully. I think part of me stopped emotionally reaching for you during those years because disappointment became exhausting. Daniel looked down at his hands heavily. You know what's horrible? He admitted quietly. I honestly thought you were stronger than me back then. Naomi blinked slightly through tears. What? You handled everything so calmly. His voice weakened. I thought you didn't need much emotionally. A sad laugh escaped her. No, Daniel. She shook her head softly. I just stopped believing asking would change anything. The truth hit him like physical weight. Because he suddenly understood something devastating. Naomi's silence was never emotional independence. It was adaptation. That night, they stayed awake, talking longer than they had in years. Not fixing, not defending, just remembering honestly. The apartment in Chicago, the exhausting newborn years, the missed conversations, the loneliness, neither of them fully understood at the time. At one point, Daniel admitted quietly, I think I spent most of my life believing emotional needs were dangerous. Naomi looked at him carefully. Dangerous? He nodded slowly. If someone needed something emotionally from me, and I didn't know how to provide it. He exhaled heavily. I felt like a failure, immediately. Naomi's expression softened with painful understanding. So you avoided emotional situations you couldn't control. Yeah. The honesty sat quietly between them. Naomi realized something important then. Daniel's emotional absence was never rooted in lack of love. It was rooted in fear. Fear of inadequacy. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of failing emotionally in ways he couldn't professionally solve. And somehow that realization made the pain both easier and harder to carry simultaneously. Daniel looked at her carefully. You know what I regret most? Naomi stayed quiet. That you spent years translating your pain into smaller versions so I wouldn't shut down. Emotion rose unexpectedly in her chest. Because, yes, that was exactly what she did, over and over again. And somewhere along the way, she became emotionally fluent in minimizing herself. The next workshop session focused on endings. How do people know when a relationship is truly changing? The instructor asked the room. No one answered immediately. Then Elliot spoke quietly from across the circle. When both people stop protecting themselves more than they protect the connection. The sentence settled deeply inside Naomi, because that was exactly what Daniel seemed to be learning now. For years he protected himself from emotional discomfort constantly. Now he stayed inside hard conversations instead of escaping them. That mattered. After class ended, Naomi and Elliot lingered near the coffee station. You seem emotional lately, he observed gently. Naomi smiled faintly. I think healing is messier than I expected. Elliot nodded knowingly. It usually is. Naomi wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I thought if things improved with my husband, I'd just feel relieved. She looked down briefly. Instead, I feel grief too. For the years lost? Yes. Elliot studied her carefully. You know what people rarely talk about? He said softly. Sometimes, reconciliation requires mourning the old version of the relationship completely. Naomi looked up slowly. What do you mean? You can't rebuild intimacy by pretending the damage never happened. His voice remained gentle. The old relationship ends first. Then something more honest either grows or it doesn't. Those words followed Naomi all the way home. Because deep down, she knew he was right. She and Daniel were not returning to who they used to be. That version of the marriage was gone. Whatever survived now would need to be built differently. More honestly, more intentionally, more emotionally awake. A few days later, Daniel found an old voicemail while cleaning emails on his phone. Naomi's voice, dated almost 4 years earlier. He pressed play, absently. Hey, I know you're busy. Ava got the internship she wanted today. A pause. She was hoping you'd call when you get a chance. Another pause. Softer now. I miss you. The message ended there. Daniel stared at the phone in stunned silence. I miss you. Not, I love you. Not, come home soon. I miss you. As if he had already emotionally left long before he realized it himself. A horrible ache spread slowly through his chest. How many cries for connection had he overlooked because they sounded calm instead of dramatic? He sat back heavily in his chair. Then, suddenly, another realization struck him. Naomi almost never sounded angry over the years. She sounded lonely. And he confused quiet loneliness with emotional stability. God, the shame of that realization nearly hollowed him out. That evening, Naomi returned home, emotionally drained, not from conflict, from remembering. Healing forced old memories into the open now. Moments she buried for years suddenly resurfaced constantly. Daniel noticed immediately when she walked inside. "You okay?" Naomi nodded automatically, then stopped herself, because old habits were hard to break. Actually, not really. Daniel's expression softened instantly. "What's going on?" Naomi sat down slowly at the kitchen island. "I think I'm grieving how long I felt emotionally alone." Daniel stayed silent, listening, really listening. Naomi rubbed her hands together quietly. "Some days I feel hopeful about us." Her eyes lowered. "And other days, I remember how deeply lonely I became. And it all hurts again." Daniel moved closer carefully. "I understand." "No," Naomi whispered sadly. "I don't think you fully can." The honesty hurt. But she wasn't wrong. Daniel understood intellectually now. Emotionally, he would probably spend the rest of his life trying to comprehend the depth of what she carried privately beside him. Naomi looked at him with tears gathering quietly again. "The hardest part is that I loved you the entire time." The sentence nearly broke him, because he knew she was telling the truth, even at her loneliest. She loved him. Daniel crouched beside her chair slowly. "I know I can't undo the damage," he said softly, "but I need you to know something." Naomi looked at him carefully. "I would rather spend the rest of my life learning how to emotionally love you properly." His voice weakened slightly, "than go back to being the man who made you feel invisible." Silence filled the kitchen afterward, and for the first time in years, Naomi believed he truly meant it. December arrived wrapped in snow and quiet reflection. The house felt different now, not because all the pain disappeared, because honesty lived there finally. Some nights were warm and emotionally close. Others reopened old wounds unexpectedly. But neither of them avoided the truth anymore. And strangely, that made the marriage feel more alive than it had in years. A week before Christmas, Naomi stood in the attic sorting old boxes while Daniel searched for holiday decorations nearby. Dust floated softly through cold afternoon light, spilling from the small attic window. "Found the lights," Daniel called. Naomi smiled faintly. "You said that 30 minutes ago." "I'm emotionally processing the organization system." She laughed softly under her breath. The sound still affected him every time. Daniel glanced toward her carefully. There it was again. That small, quiet version of joy returning to her face more often now. Not constant, not effortless, but returning. Then, Naomi, suddenly, became still. Daniel noticed immediately. What happened? She held up a small cardboard ornament carefully. A child's handwriting covered the front in glitter. "Our family, 2007. Ava had made it in elementary school." Naomi stared at it silently for several seconds. Then, unexpectedly, tears filled her eyes. Daniel moved closer immediately. "Hey." Naomi laughed weakly while wiping her face. "I'm sorry. No apologizing." The gentle firmness in his voice made her emotional all over again. She held the ornament carefully between both hands. "I remember this Christmas." Daniel stayed quiet. "You worked almost the entire week." Her voice softened. "Ava kept asking when you'd come downstairs." Pain crossed Daniel's face immediately. God, he barely remembered that Christmas at all. Not because it lacked importance, because work consumed so much of his mental life back then that entire emotional seasons blurred together. Naomi looked down at the ornament sadly. "I told myself it was temporary." Daniel felt something twist painfully inside his chest, because that sentence described almost their entire marriage. Temporary distance, temporary exhaustion, temporary emotional neglect, until temporary quietly became normal. "I missed so much," he whispered. Naomi looked at him carefully. Yes, the honesty hurt, but she no longer softened every truth to protect him from discomfort. And strangely, Daniel appreciated that now, because emotional honesty was how trust slowly rebuilt itself between them. He stepped closer carefully. "You know what scares me?" Naomi waited quietly. "That I'll never fully understand how much pain you carried alone." Emotion flickered across her face. Then softly, "You're understanding more than you used to." And for now, that was enough. Later that evening, they decorated the Christmas tree together. Music played softly. Snow fell outside. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon again. At one point, Naomi stopped beside the tree, holding an ornament Daniel gave her during their second year of marriage. A tiny glass lighthouse. "You remember why you bought this?" she asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "You said lighthouses made you feel safe." Naomi looked surprised. "You remember that?" I remember more now that I'm paying attention. The sentence settled quietly between them, not as an excuse, as grief, because attention had always been the missing language between them. Naomi hung the ornament carefully onto the tree. Then, unexpectedly, she admitted, "For a long time, I convinced myself wanting emotional closeness made me needy." Daniel's face tightened immediately. "Naomi." She shook her head, softly. "No, listen." Her eyes lowered. "I spent years minimizing my own pain because you always looked exhausted already." Daniel felt guilt spread through him again. "I made you feel like your emotions were too much." "No." Naomi looked at him carefully. "You made me feel like there wasn't room for them." The distinction hit him deeply. Because yes, that was exactly what happened. Daniel moved toward her slowly. "There should have always been room for you." Emotion rose visibly in Naomi's eyes hearing that, because part of her still mourned how desperately she once needed those words. And part of her still couldn't believe she was finally hearing them now. A few days later, Ava came home for Christmas. The moment she walked inside, she paused dramatically. "What?" Daniel asked cautiously. Ava narrowed her eyes suspiciously. "You two are flirting." Naomi nearly choked on her tea, while Daniel groaned immediately. "We are not." "You made cinnamon bread together," Ava replied. "That's basically emotional foreplay for married people over 50. Naomi burst into helpless laughter. Even Daniel couldn't stop smiling. And suddenly, Ava became quiet. She looked between them carefully. "You know," she said softly, "I haven't heard Mom laugh like this in a really long time." The room fell silent afterward, because everyone understood the emotional weight behind that statement. Naomi looked down quickly. Daniel stared at the floor. And Ava suddenly looked emotional herself. "I think I forgot what it felt like when this house wasn't emotionally tense all the time," she admitted quietly. Daniel swallowed hard, because he never realized how deeply the emotional distance affected their daughter too. Not through screaming, not through chaos, through absence. Ava sat beside her mother gently. "I'm proud of both of you." Naomi smiled faintly. "We still have a lot to work through." "I know," Ava said softly, "but this feels real now. Real, not performative stability, not emotional avoidance disguised as peace. Real, messy, tender, honest. And maybe honesty mattered more than perfection ever did. Christmas Eve arrived quietly. Snow covered the neighborhood, while warm lights glowed softly through the house. After dinner, Ava disappeared upstairs to call friends, leaving Naomi and Daniel alone in the living room beside the tree. The fire crackled softly nearby. For several minutes, they sat in comfortable silence. Then Daniel spoke quietly. "Can I tell you something?" Naomi looked over. "Okay." He hesitated briefly. "I used to think marriage survived through commitment." Naomi listened carefully. "And now?" Daniel stared at the fire thoughtfully. "Now I think commitment without emotional presence eventually becomes loneliness with legal paperwork." Naomi blinked in surprise, then, unexpectedly laughed softly. That was strangely poetic. Daniel smiled faintly. "Therapy." The warmth between them settled gently into the room. Then his expression turned serious again. "I need to ask you something honestly." Naomi became still. "Do you think we're going to make it?" The vulnerability in his voice nearly broke her heart. Because for the first time in their marriage, Daniel sounded emotionally afraid to lose her. Naomi looked down at her hands quietly. Months ago, she wouldn't have known how to answer. Now? She still wasn't certain, but something inside her had shifted. Not blind hope, not denial. Trust growing slowly through consistency. "I think," she said carefully, "for the first time in years, we're actually participating in the same marriage emotionally." Daniel absorbed the words silently. Naomi looked at him fully then. "That matters." Emotion filled his face immediately, because, deep down, he knew she was right. They weren't surviving beside each other anymore. They were finally seeing each other, and after 20 years of emotional distance, that felt almost miraculous. Later that night, Naomi stood alone in the kitchen rinsing dishes when Daniel entered quietly behind her. "You missed one," he said softly, pointing toward a plate. Naomi smiled faintly. "Thanks." Daniel lingered beside her for a second longer than necessary. Then suddenly, "I found that voicemail." Naomi frowned slightly. "What voicemail?" "The one where you said you missed me." Recognition crossed her face slowly. "Oh." Daniel looked down briefly. "You sounded lonely." Naomi's chest tightened. "I was." He nodded carefully. "I know that now." Silence filled the kitchen. Then Daniel spoke again, voice rougher now. "You know what destroys me?" He swallowed hard. "You kept reaching for me emotionally for years, and I genuinely believed we still had plenty of time." Naomi stared at him quietly. Daniel's eyes filled slightly. "I didn't realize people stop waiting long before they stop loving." The sentence settled into the room, like truth finally spoken aloud. And suddenly, Naomi understood something important. Daniel wasn't changing because he feared losing comfort. He was changing because he finally understood the emotional cost of his absence. That difference mattered more than she ever expected it would. By January, the marriage no longer felt like something quietly dying. It felt like something rebuilding itself carefully from the truth. Not the old version. That version was gone. The version where Naomi stayed silent to keep peace. The version where Daniel hid inside work and responsibility. The version where loneliness lived quietly between them while both pretended stability meant happiness. They couldn't return to that marriage anymore. And maybe that was good. Because healing did not come from recovering the past. It came from finally becoming honest enough to create something different. One snowy Sunday morning, Naomi woke before sunrise and found Daniel already downstairs. Soft music played quietly through the kitchen while he stood near the stove making tea. Not coffee, tea. He looked up immediately when she entered. "You remembered," she said softly. Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm learning." There was still something surreal about that sentence. Not because remembering tea solved everything. Because attention carries emotional meaning when someone spent years feeling unnoticed. Naomi wrapped a blanket tighter around herself and sat at the kitchen island. For a few quiet minutes, neither spoke. Then Daniel slid the mug gently toward her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Naomi stared at the steam rising from the tea. "How strange it feels to emotionally come back to a marriage I already grieved." Daniel absorbed the words carefully. Months ago he might have rushed to reassure her immediately. Now he understood. Some truths simply needed space. Finally, he asked softly, "Do you regret staying?" Naomi looked up in surprise. The vulnerability behind the question touched her immediately. She thought about it honestly. 20 years, loneliness, patience, disappointment, love, grief. Then quietly, "No." Emotion flickered visibly across Daniel's face. Naomi continued gently, "But I do regret how long I abandoned myself while trying to preserve us." The honesty hurt both of them. Because it was true. Daniel lowered his eyes. "You shouldn't have had to disappear to love me." Naomi's throat tightened unexpectedly. That sentence healed something quietly wounded inside her for years. Not because it erased the pain, because finally, someone understood it. Later that week, Naomi attended the final writing workshop session. The classroom felt bittersweet now. For months, this space helped her reconnect with parts of herself buried beneath years of emotional survival. Tonight's final assignment was simple. Write about what you've learned. People shared slowly around the room. Grief, growth, fear, identity. Then Naomi read hers aloud. "I learned that emotional neglect rarely begins with cruelty. Sometimes it begins with postponement. One person keeps saying, later, after work calms down, after life gets easier, after stress passes. And the other person waits patiently because love still exists. Until eventually, the waiting itself becomes grief." The room remained completely silent. Naomi continued softly. "I also learned that people can love each other sincerely and still fail each other emotionally." Her eyes lowered briefly. But failure becomes transformation when honesty finally replaces avoidance. Emotion tightened in her chest. Because this story was no longer only about heartbreak. It was about awakening too. When the reading ended, Elliot approached her quietly afterward. "That was beautiful," he said gently. Naomi smiled softly. "Thank you." They stood near the empty classroom while snow drifted outside the windows again. "You seem different than when you first walked in here," Elliot observed. "I am." "How?" Naomi thought carefully before answering. "I think I stopped confusing endurance with love." Elliot smiled faintly. "That's an important lesson." She nodded, slowly. "And I think my husband stopped confusing responsibility with emotional presence." A warm understanding crossed Elliot's face. "You still love him very much." Naomi smiled quietly this time. "Yes." No fear in the answer anymore. Just truth. Elliot studied her gently for a second. "You know, sometimes relationships survive not because people avoid breaking." He paused carefully. "But because they finally become honest enough to rebuild from the broken parts." Naomi felt emotion rise softly inside her chest. Because that was exactly what had happened. Not perfect healing, honest healing. And somehow, that mattered more. Before leaving, Elliot hugged her briefly. "I'm glad you found your voice again." Naomi smiled through sudden emotion. "Me too." That evening, Daniel waited awake for her in the living room. Not distracted, not working, waiting. When Naomi entered, he stood immediately. "How was the last session?" She removed her coat slowly. "Emotional." Daniel smiled faintly. "That sounds about right." Naomi laughed softly before sitting beside him on the couch. For a moment, they simply looked at each other quietly. And suddenly Naomi realized something profound. She no longer felt emotionally alone beside him. The realization almost overwhelmed her. Daniel reached for her hand carefully. "How are you feeling?" Naomi looked down at their hands intertwined together. "Honest." He nodded slowly. "Me too." Silence settled softly around them. Comfortable now. Then Naomi asked quietly, "Can I tell you something?" always. The word still affected her every time now. Not because he said it, because lately, he meant it. Naomi took a slow breath. There were moments I almost emotionally left this marriage completely. Daniel's expression tightened slightly, but he stayed present, listening. I know, he said softly. No, I mean really left. Her voice weakened slightly. Not physically, emotionally. Daniel's eyes lowered. Naomi continued carefully. I reached a point where I stopped imagining a future where I felt truly seen by you. The honesty hurt him visibly. But, unlike before, he did not retreat from it. Instead, he moved closer. I know I gave you reasons to feel that way. Tears gathered quietly in Naomi's eyes. Do you know what changed? Daniel looked at her carefully. You stopped trying to defend yourself long enough to finally hear me. The truth settled deeply between them. Because yes, that was the beginning of everything changing. Not flowers, not dinners, not therapy. Listening, real listening. Without ego, without rushing, without emotional escape. Daniel touched her hand gently. You know what therapy made me realize? Naomi shook her head softly. I spent most of my life terrified of emotional failure. He swallowed carefully. And in trying so hard to avoid failing emotionally. His voice weakened. I emotionally failed the person I loved most anyway. The raw honesty nearly broke her heart. Because she knew how difficult that admission was for him. Naomi leaned her head slowly against his shoulder. Not because everything was magically perfect now. Because, for the first time in years, resting emotionally beside him no longer felt lonely. A few days later, Ava visited again. The moment she walked into the house, she narrowed her eyes dramatically. Oh my God. Daniel sighed immediately. What now? You two are emotionally healthy. This is terrifying. Naomi burst into laughter, while Daniel shook his head. Ava smiled watching them. Then softer. You know what's weird? What? Naomi asked. The house feels lighter. Silence followed briefly, because everyone understood what she meant. For years, tension lived quietly here. Not loud tension. Emotional distance, careful conversations, loneliness, hidden beneath routine. Now the house felt emotionally lived in again. Messy sometimes, vulnerable sometimes, but alive. Ava hugged her mother tightly before turning toward Daniel. And you, she pointed dramatically, better keep going to therapy. Daniel laughed quietly. Yes, ma'am. Naomi watched them together, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Peace, not perfect certainty, not fantasy, just emotional peace, rooted in honesty. And honestly, that felt more valuable than perfection ever could. By early February, Naomi realized something quietly extraordinary had happened. She stopped preparing herself for disappointment every time Daniel showed emotional effort. The change came gradually, one conversation at a time, one remembered detail at a time, one emotionally present moment at a time. Consistency. That was what rebuilt trust. Not dramatic promises. Consistency strong enough to convince the heart it no longer needed armor inside love. One evening, Naomi sat at the dining table editing another essay, while Daniel cooked nearby. Actually cooked, without burning anything. Progress. Soft jazz drifted through the kitchen, while snow moved lazily outside the windows. Daniel glanced over occasionally while stirring soup. You've been smiling at that paragraph for 5 minutes, he observed. Naomi looked up. I finally got the ending right. Can I hear it? The question still carried emotional weight now, because for years, Daniel rarely asked about her inner world, unless prompted. Now, curiosity came naturally. Naomi looked down at the page before reading softly. Sometimes, love survives quietly beneath years of emotional distance. Not because the pain wasn't real, not because loneliness didn't matter, but because somewhere underneath disappointment, two people still hoped to be truly seen by each other again. Silence settled gently through the kitchen afterward. Daniel stared at her with visible emotion. That's us, he said quietly. Naomi smiled faintly. Yes, not perfect, not untouched, but honest. Daniel lowered the stove flame before walking toward her slowly. You know what still amazes me? What? That, after everything. His voice softened. You still let me come back emotionally. The vulnerability in his face nearly unraveled her. Because she understood something now that she didn't understand before, Daniel wasn't proud of how long it took him to wake up emotionally. He grieved it too. Naomi reached for his hand carefully. You came back honestly, she whispered. And that made all the difference. A week later, Naomi received another publication acceptance. This time she didn't hesitate before telling Daniel. He was the first person she called immediately. Not cautiously, not carefully, naturally. And that realization alone nearly made her emotional. You did? Daniel's voice filled instantly with pride over the phone. Yes, that's incredible. Naomi laughed softly, hearing genuine excitement in his voice again. For years, she trained herself not to emotionally depend on shared joy with him. Now those instincts were returning naturally. Healing really was strange. That evening, Daniel surprised her with dinner reservations at a quiet restaurant downtown. Nothing extravagant, just intentional. Halfway through dinner, Naomi suddenly became quiet, watching snow fall outside the restaurant windows. Daniel noticed immediately. "What's going on?" She smiled softly. "I was just thinking. Dangerous." Naomi laughed quietly before growing serious again. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "I spent so many years waiting for you to emotionally notice me." She looked down briefly. "That eventually, I stopped believing I mattered enough to be noticed." Daniel's expression tightened painfully. Naomi touched his hand gently before he could spiral into guilt again. "But now," she whispered. He looked at her carefully. "I feel emotionally safe enough to exist fully again." The words nearly took his breath away, because that was all he ever wanted, once he finally understood the damage. Not forgiveness, without accountability. Not comfort without change. Real emotional partnership. And, slowly, carefully, they were building it. A few nights later, Daniel sat alone in the living room rereading old journal notes from therapy. One sentence remained, underlined heavily. "Love without emotional attention eventually becomes loneliness." Months ago, reading that would have made him defensive. Now, it simply felt true. The front door opened softly. Naomi stepped inside, carrying groceries and cold winter air with her. Daniel immediately stood to help. "You don't have to do that every time," she said softly. "I want to." Simple words. Yet after years of emotional absence, intentionality mattered deeply now. They unpacked groceries together quietly. Ordinary, domestic, peaceful. Then suddenly Naomi paused, holding a carton of eggs. "What?" Daniel asked. She looked at him with emotion gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. "I think this is the first time in years home actually feels emotionally peaceful to me." The honesty hit him deeply. Not because it praised him, because he understood how long she lived without that feeling. Daniel moved closer, slowly. "I'm sorry it took me so long." Naomi shook her head gently. "I don't think either of us fully understood what was happening." He swallowed carefully. "I should have, maybe." She looked at him softly. "But you understand now." And strangely, that mattered more than perfection ever could. Later that weekend, Ava invited both of them to New York for dinner. Halfway through the evening, she leaned back, dramatically studying them across the restaurant table. "You know what's weird?" Daniel sighed immediately. "Why do all your observations start like that?" "Because I'm emotionally intelligent." Ava grinned. "Anyway." Her expression softened slightly. "You two actually look in love again." Silence settled briefly. Naomi glanced toward Daniel. Not young love. Not effortless love. Something quieter, more conscious. Daniel smiled faintly. "I don't think we stopped loving each other." "No," Ava agreed softly. "I think you stopped emotionally reaching each other." The accuracy stunned them again. Because, yes, that was exactly what happened. Not absence of love. Absence of emotional presence. Ava looked at her father carefully. "You know, Dad, I used to resent you." Daniel blinked slightly. "I know." "No, really." Her voice softened. "Because Mom spent years emotionally carrying this family while you disappeared into work." Daniel absorbed the truth quietly. No defensiveness anymore. Ava smiled faintly afterward. "But watching you change this past year." She shrugged slightly. "It matters." Emotion filled Daniel's chest unexpectedly, because healing did not only affect marriage, it affected everyone connected to it. That night, back home, Naomi stood beside the bedroom window watching snow fall softly beneath streetlights. Daniel approached quietly behind her. "What are you thinking about?" Naomi smiled faintly. "How different everything feels." Daniel wrapped his arms carefully around her waist. Not possessively, not automatically, consciously. Naomi leaned back gently against him. For years, physical closeness existed between them without emotional intimacy underneath. Now, even simple touch felt different. Warmer, safer, real. "I used to think love disappeared dramatically," Naomi whispered. Daniel rested his chin lightly against her shoulder. "And now?" She looked out at the snow quietly. "Now I think love disappears quietly when people stop paying attention to each other, emotionally." The truth settled softly between them. Then Daniel asked the question carefully. "Did you ever stop loving me?" Naomi answered immediately. "No." Emotion moved visibly across his face. She turned slowly toward him. "But I stopped believing love alone could sustain loneliness forever." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, because that sentence contained the entire lesson of their marriage. Love mattered, commitment mattered, but emotional presence mattered too. Without it, even devoted people could slowly lose each other while staying under the same roof. Naomi touched his face gently. "You know what saved us?" Daniel looked at her quietly. "You finally became willing to emotionally hear things that made you uncomfortable." The honesty in her voice humbled him completely, because she was right. Healing began the moment he stopped protecting himself from difficult truths. Daniel covered her hand with his, carefully. I wasted a lot of years emotionally asleep. Naomi's eyes softened. Yes, no denial, no pretending otherwise, just truth. Then, gently. But you woke up before I stopped loving you completely. Emotion overwhelmed him suddenly at the sentence, because deep down, he knew how close he came to losing her emotionally forever. Naomi smiled softly through gathering tears. And I think that's why we survived. Outside, snow continued falling quietly across the neighborhood. Inside, after 20 years of marriage, Naomi finally stopped waiting. And Daniel finally learned how to stay emotionally present long enough to truly see her. And that's the truth so many people learn too late. Love is not only about staying faithful. It's not only about paying bills. It's not only about remaining married for years. Real love requires emotional presence. Because sometimes people don't fall out of love. They slowly fall out of feeling seen. Tonight's story reminds us that healing becomes possible when pride is replaced with honesty, when listening becomes more important than defending, and when two people finally choose to emotionally show up for each other again. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and share this story with someone who needs this reminder today. And before you go, tell me honestly in the comments, what hurts a relationship more? Lack of love, or lack of emotional attention? I read your comments carefully, and your stories matter here. Until next time, protect the people you love by making them feel seen while there's still time.